Hello! Welcome to the fourth and final part of why I dislike being a Star Wars fan. If you haven't seen the previous videos in the series, or at least the first part, I would recommend that you do so, as they actually cover some of the rules for this whole series of reviews, and also kind of help inform some of my opinions going forward, and why I think the way that I do. But if you have seen those previous parts, or just don't really give a shit, then let's move on, shall we? I should mention this, as it may have caused a little bit of confusion. While this series did start airing before The Rise of Skywalker, Season 1 ended after the premiere of Rise of Skywalker. I figured that I'd count when the season finale aired to be when I would discuss it. Also, highlighting all the theatrical films and the shows is also just a much better flow than awkwardly dropping a series review and dipping. I figured I'd just go episode by episode, as I find it would be easier instead of randomly switching between episodes when discussing certain topics. I think this is a great pilot. I know that concept has kind of gotten lost to time with the era of streaming, but seriously, imagine if we still only operated on basic cable, and they dropped this in order to see if it was picked up for syndication. Literally, the first scene alone already perfectly sums up what the show is going for. A sort of samurai western-type show set in the Star Wars universe. The way Mando enters the scene with that bass recorder in the back and everyone goes silent, it has the same vibe as the local sheriff who just walked into the saloon. Hell, even the fact that one of the first things he does in the show is cut someone in half with a door, it shows he means business and that he's not to be fucked with. Even Jango or Boba Fett didn't do anything this gruesome, at least not on screen. I also think it's interesting that this episode is the first time Life Day has been mentioned on screen since 1978. That I can recall, anyway. I'm also pretty sure it's the first time that at least Life Day itself is canon. Correct me if I'm wrong. I probably am. Honestly, I think my biggest criticism with the episode is one single line because it's probably one of the most awkward pieces of exposition I've seen. The thing about exposition is you don't really want to feel like you're being told what's going on. If the dialogue sounds right, or is in the right place in the story, you probably won't think about how you're basically just being told necessary information. But when you have Mando randomly drop that he's a foundling to someone that not only knows that, but also one that I assume he has a somewhat close connection with, it's really strange. I'm not even kidding when I say that if you dropped that line, this episode would basically be perfect. Especially since if you drop the line, you still have Mando having flashbacks to his childhood. You can put two and two together. This first episode just builds a lot of intrigue and does a terrific job of establishing the tone of this season. This episode is directed by Dave Filoni, and I think the way he approaches this was pretty good. He's a very big fan of Star Wars, and I feel like you can tell by how this episode was done. That cliffhanger is also pretty damn good. I quite like this episode. While I think there are definitely better ones in the season, it's a pretty good continuation and also sets up why Baby Yoda, I obviously know he has a proper name, but I'm saving that for later, this is what people had to call him for over a year, so I'm sticking with it, is pretty important to this show. This episode was directed by Rick Famuyiwa. I think his approach to this episode was interesting, although it shines much more later in the season. I also like how this episode directly sets up a reveal much later on in the series. It's a moment I didn't even think about until this most recent rewatch. I also love the Jawas in this episode. Beforehand, we never really got much from them. It was always pretty bare bones, so it's nice to see a little more of them. Also, seeing Mando almost burn one alive is highly amusing, even if a little fucked up. If I had a nickel for every time Pedro Pascal played an emotionally unavailable character who grew an attachment to a kid they saw as their child and decided to rescue them out of their own selfish reasons, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's really weird that it's happened twice, right? Okay, I mean, obviously it's a bit of an oversimplification, especially for why they rescue the kid, but there's a reason he was cast as Joel in the Last of Us show. I'll be honest, one of the only parts about this episode I actually remember is the ending with Mando saving Baby Yoda and all the other Mandalorians helping him and also exposing their hideout. Because otherwise, even when I was watching it, I didn't have much to write down. Deborah Chow directed this one, and I think she does great work with that ending, but I think what she was given for the rest of this episode wasn't a lot. This is probably my favorite episode, but It's also just Seven Samurai. Like, no joke, it's basically one-to-one the plot of Seven Samurai. A village keeps getting raided by a group of bandits, so the people who live there must be trained in order to fight off said bandits. Really, the only difference is rather than being Seven Samurai, it's one bounty hunter and one former rebel shock trooper. Also, last time I checked, there wasn't an ATST in Seven Samurai, but I could be wrong. This is the only episode this season that Bryce Dallas Howard directed, and I think she did a good job, especially since she was tasked with one of the hardest episodes to do. I love so much about this episode, and I love how it's the first one where Mando really starts questioning what he's doing and who he is. Like, there's the moment he takes off his helmet in front of an open window. You know he probably doesn't do it often, but this was right after being asked about it. I also think the connection he makes to these villagers is such a nice progression, as beforehand, he'd almost always be extremely deadpan with people. He was a man of few words. I also love the scene where Baby Yoda's just watching Mando and Cara Dune fight while just having soup. I find it highly amusing and adorable. I'll be honest, this is probably the one I have the least to say about. I also think it's not really that important to the overall narrative of this season. It's important for later seasons, sure, but in this season, not really. I think this is easily the weakest episode and is such a huge contrast compared to the last episode. This episode was also directed by Dave Filoni, and I feel like he didn't have much to do here like he did with episode 1. While I feel like this one also doesn't have much to do with the overall story of the season, it makes up for it by actually being a really damn good episode. Rick Famuyiwa was brought back for this episode, and this is where I think he really shines. This cast, this setting, even this story is super interesting. I also think it does a little world building while also mentioning a bit of Mando's past, which this entire season has been mostly mysterious. This one was directed by Deborah Chow, and I feel like she had a lot more to do here. I quite like this one, as it's where everything is starting to come together. I love how it not only showcases Baby Yoda's other abilities, like the fact he apparently knows how to force choke someone, but it also established force healing. Yeah, this episode aired literally 2 days before Rise of Skywalker came out. I wonder if it was a complete coincidence, or maybe they were trying to lessen the impact. It didn't work. Actually, this might be a hot take. I think Baby Yoda being able to force heal makes even less sense than Rey or Kylo being able to do it. Do I think it's stupid there too? Absolutely. But at least you can use the excuse that they're more in tune with the Force and both have slightly more training in some ways. I can't say the same for Baby Yoda. Not to mention that every time we see him use the Force, it tuckers him out. Moreover, the explanation for Force healing in Rise of Skywalker was that it's a transference of life force. Now, I obviously can't tell how much life force someone has, or if it can be regained in some way, but I feel like it should have done a lot more to Baby Yoda than it actually did. I kind of like how it was set up earlier, but I also just think it doesn't make much sense given not only what we're told about it in Rise of Skywalker, but also just the rest of the series, in regards to movies and shows anyway. It just doesn't make sense. A positive I'll also give this episode is Moff Gideon being introduced. Granted, he's basically just Space Gus Fring, but at the same time, I like Gus Fring. Side note, Jesus Christ, please stop typecasting Giancarlo Esposito as a villain. I swear he plays the same character in everything, and he's definitely good at it, but sometimes you need to be versatile. I also love IG-11 in this episode. I have no idea why. Maybe I just love the idea of a deadly bounty hunter droid start serving tea and look after Baby Yoda. I just find it amusing. The only episode in this season directed by Taika Waititi, and you can kind of tell, mainly because of the opening scene. While I actually do like it, I understand that it has almost nothing to do with the rest of the story and can really drag at times. Aside from that opening though, I think it's a pretty good episode. It's action-packed enough where it feels like a good finale, but not too much where you're just like, okay, we get it. I also love how this episode has Mando accepting droids and is even willing to show his face to one. Granted, it's because of a loophole and the fact he was badly hurt, but whatever. Even having him care for when IG-11 died was really good. The first droid he actually has a connection to sacrificed himself like not even an hour after that happened. I also love how this episode has the post-credits scene of Moff Gideon with the Darksaber, especially since we meet Paz Vizsla in this show, and obviously the Vizsla name is very important to the Darksaber. And also the Darksaber is just incredibly important for Mandalorians in general. I think it's a great cliffhanger for Season 2, and also rewards you for having seen a good chunk of Star Wars stuff outside of it, even though I think it's fine enough on its own. This is actually really interesting to cover. This show's music was done by Ludwig Göransson. If you don't know who that is, you've probably heard his music. He did the music for every single one of Ryan Coogler's films, including this year's Sinners, both Black Panther films, and the first two Creed films. Ryan Coogler didn't direct Creed 2, but it's easier to group them together. He worked with Christopher Nolan on Tenet and Oppenheimer, the latter of which he won his second Oscar for. He also worked on the first Venom movie and Turning Red. That's just a sample of the movies he's worked on. I think he did a fantastic job here. Not only is the music just nice to listen to at times, it also has that same vibe as a lot of cowboy movies. According to Göransson, the very first thing he did after getting the job was just buying a bunch of different recorders, as he knew he wanted to have that be the basis for at least Mando's theme. He found one that he really liked, which was a bass recorder. For the rest of the theme, he went on to drums, then piano, really only for bass though, and a guitar to double up on it. He doesn't go much into the thought process for a lot of the other themes, except for what they're supposed to be about. There were many challenges while working on the music for this series. The first one is how the music is absolutely necessary to musically communicate Mando as a character. Obviously, you can't see his face, so the music has to fill in those gaps for you, even if you don't realize it is. Another challenge for him was the fact he basically had to score enough music for what may as well have been 3 feature films, which makes sense as the entire season is about 5.5 hours in length. I think the production design is great in this season. It still uses quite a bit of practical effects, like for example, Queel, played by Misty Roses on set, and voiced by Nick Nolte. Not only is Misty doing a little bit of the puppeteering work, so are a few other people by remote control. But I think there's 2 big highlights when it comes to production design on this show. The first is Baby Yoda. He's mostly practical with some CG tweaking, whenever he isn't just entirely CGI. He was puppeteered by 2 technicians, one for the eyes and mouth, while the other was for the other facial expressions. The other big highlight is something called the Stagecraft Volume. Basically what it was, rather than shooting everything on green screen, they shot a good number of scenes against actual LED screens. There are many benefits to this. The main one being that even though you're still in a set, you don't have to pretend like you're actually in a specific location. That visual's already there for you, so actors like Ewan McGregor who couldn't get used to blue/green screen finally had something to work off of. Another advantage, especially with this production, was the fact that there wouldn't be nearly as much CG work. There wouldn't be a lot of figuring out how certain characters are supposed to be lit and how the environment reflects that. It's also especially helpful because of Mando's costume. I think any CG artist that would have had to replace every single hint of green or blue on Mando's costume just to make sure it had the right reflection, or just replace it with a completely digital one to make it easier, would absolutely despise this production and the costume department. Although a big thing with it was because of how it worked, huge portions of the show needed pre-visualization even if it was just for mundane scenes. That way, CG artists would be able to make the full 360 backdrop necessary for any given scene, because basically all of it needed to be pre-rendered beforehand. There's actually a ton of references or callbacks to previous pieces of Star Wars media. For example, Incinerator Stormtroopers from the Force Unleashed game show up. Death Troopers from Rogue One, the ice cream maker that was infamous in Empire Strikes Back, is actually given a purpose in this show, mainly as some sort of briefcase. And Blurgs from the Ewok movies are also in this show. Because there wasn't enough Stormtrooper costumes on set for when they were filming episodes 7 and 8, they hired members of the 501st Legion fan club to fill in. In the documentary series Disney Gallery, The Making of the Mandalorian, you really get a feel for how excited they were to be a part of an official Star Wars production, and I love that. Taika Waititi stated that Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni really helped him not to go too far off the beaten path in terms of his direction. A good chunk of Mando's scenes in the entire season don't even have Pedro Pascal in costume. During some of Pedro Pascal's recording sessions, he'd hold a pillow to simulate holding Baby Yoda. Initially, Carl Weathers was only going to be in episodes 1 and 3, and was also going to be completely covered in prosthetics. This was changed after he auditioned and got the part, however. Mark Hamill actually does an uncredited voice in episode 5 when he voices a droid working at the cantina. This is a pretty good season of television. I also think it's just great Star Wars content as well. It's clearly taking a different approach to the Star Wars universe, but still keeping some of its original inspirations. Mainly Akira Kurosawa, which was obviously a huge influence on Star Wars and just George Lucas in general. I think this is a great way to make something that still feels like Star Wars, but still do something new and interesting in the universe, especially when you contrast it with the sequel trilogy, except for Last Jedi, where it just felt completely derivative of the original trilogy. I'll give The Mandalorian Season 1 an 8 out of 10. This is some damn good Star Wars. While this season is also pretty good, Season 1 is still better. I feel like you can tell there was a much different approach here. Season 1 was written for the most part by Jon Favreau, so it had a mostly coherent narrative. It may as well have just been a 5.5 hour long film. Even though it's the same situation, it feels like there's a lot more disconnect between episodes in terms of approach of their stories. Yeah, so, this is just Dune. Like, pretty unapologetically. I mean, there were already those comparisons beforehand, but I think it's even more obvious here. You can't tell me that the Krayt Dragon isn't at least inspired by how the Sandworms act, and the Tusken Raiders here are clearly filling in for the role of the Fremen. Here's the thing, though. I like Dune. So I'm not complaining, but it is the easiest parallel to draw while watching this episode. I also feel like it still has those Western influences. I mean, there's Mando riding in on his speeder through Mos Pelgo. It's even combined with him receiving dirty looks from everyone. Hell, even when Cobb Vanth shows up in Boba Fett's armor, it's reminiscent of a sheriff or something walking into the saloon to see who's causing all the trouble, something that they actually used for Mando in the last season. I think the best sequence in this whole episode is when they actually fight the Krayt Dragon. The residents of Mos Pelgo and the Tusken Raiders band together to take down this common enemy, and it's just a well-done sequence. Something I like about it is the moment it starts, the aspect ratio widens significantly. It isn't subtle either. Honestly, I think this episode's biggest problem is its pacing. It's the second longest episode of the entire series, and you can definitely feel it at times. It was also the only episode of the entire show to be directed by Jon Favreau himself. This was still a great episode, and a really good way to bring fans back into the series, not to mention that little Boba Fett tease at the end. I liked this episode, but I feel like it's pretty unnecessary for the overall story. I don't know if it makes any sense, but it feels like its only purpose is to keep this season 8 episodes long, and to set up episode 3. Now I know how that sounds. Well, of course it sets up the next episode. That's how shows work. Yes, but there needs to be more connective tissue if you're doing an overarching narrative like this season is. The only important things established in this episode is Mando meeting Frog Lady so she can look after Baby Yoda in the next episode, and that Mando's ship is super fucked up, which leads into the events of episode 3. Almost everything else is completely disregarded or not mentioned until much later on in the show. This was the first episode of the show to be directed by Peyton Reed, and I feel like you can kind of tell. Not to say it's bad or anything, but I do feel like it has a certain energy that his other films, mainly the Ant-Man films, have. I'll be honest, even after I watched this episode, I don't remember much about it. Like, it introduces Bo-Katan in live action and builds intrigue on the Darksaber. I guess it also starts planting seeds in Mando's head about the Way and how it overall differs from the other Mandalorians. Otherwise, I would not be able to tell you the intricacies of it. It's probably my second least favorite in the season, which is a shame because Bryce Dallas Howard directed this one, and she directed my favorite episode from last season. This is my least favorite episode in the season. I still remember some parts of episode 3, but if you pointed a gun to my head and asked me what I remember about this episode, you'd have the removal of Jean's guy, and a reference to midichlorians. Maybe also that Carl Weathers directed this episode. Otherwise, I basically remember nothing or why it's important to the season. If episode 1 of this season really drew inspiration from the Western aspects of Mandalorian, then this episode really drew inspiration from the samurai aspects of Mandalorian. Akira Kurosawa films were the major inspiration for this episode in not only the story, cinematography, but also action. It also marks the live-action debut of Ahsoka Tano, played by Rosario Dawson. I think the look she has for her character is pretty good, and I can't help but think Rosario was great for this role. This is also when we learn of Baby Yoda's name, that being Grogu. I remember there was some discourse about how his name didn't start with a Y like the other characters of Yoda's species. Then again, we really only had Yoda and Yaddle to go off of. This is such a great episode, and it's the only one this season directed by Dave Filoni. Makes sense if it involves Ahsoka. I think it has a great self-contained story, I like what it sets up for the rest of the season, and I think it gives just a good enough taste of Rosario Dawson as Ahsoka Tano for any future projects. I really like this episode because it's basically just Boba Fett central. This is the episode where the tease for Boba Fett became important and that Fennec Shand from the last season became important again. That's actually why I said episode 5 was the least important from only last season. This episode was directed by Robert Rodriguez, and you can tell he had a real love for Boba Fett as a character. The way he wanted to approach this episode was as if Boba Fett would never appear again. He wanted to do everything he could with Boba Fett before moving on. I feel like he accomplished it, and that this episode was the best return for Boba you could give. I think it's insanely funny how the highlight of this episode is Bill Burr's performance as Miggs Mayfield, when he himself is not only not that big into Star Wars, but has even mocked both it and its fans in the past. There's a certain irony that I quite love there. I also like this episode. I think it was a smart move to have Rick Famuyiwa direct this episode, as he also directed episode 6 of the last season, which is the one that introduced Mayfield. You can definitely tell they're by the same guy, as they have a very similar feel. Although this episode also introduces the new repainted look for Boba Fett, and I'll be honest, I'm still iffy over it. Does it look clean? Yeah, but I feel like that's kind of the problem. With the amount of scratches and stuff the original look had, not only did it fit in with George Lucas's lived-in aesthetic he wanted for A New Hope, but also showcased possible battle damage. Those scratches were basically a form of storytelling. You immediately knew, this guy's been in some scuffles and isn't afraid to let others know. So when you take that away by simply repainting it, you lose some of that original essence of the character, what little there already was. I know that rant had practically nothing to do with this episode, I just wanted to get it off my chest. I also like how this episode has the idea of Mando's beliefs, and is he willing to break the code he lives by just to save Grogu? I think it's well done, and how you don't even need dialogue to understand what his conflict in this episode is. Also, Mando's cheeky recreation of Moff Gideon's monologue from episode 7 of season 1 is still one of my favorite moments from the entire show. This episode is still pretty great, even almost 5 years after its initial release. Episode 2 and this are the only episodes in the season directed by the same person, that being Peyton Reed. Honestly, there's not a lot in this episode specifically that tells me it's done by Peyton Reed, but I think it's excellent. I love Moff Gideon here. It feels like he has slightly more to do in this than the last season, and Giancarlo Esposito still plays it beautifully. One of my favorite moments is when he gloats to both Mando and Bo-Katan about the Darksaber, and it's genuinely just so great. Then there's the elephant in the room. One of the main things people refer to when it comes to this episode, deepfake Luke Skywalker. I'm gonna go way more into detail later than I will here, but believe me, I do not like this choice. It's very uncanny valley for a lot of reasons. It slightly makes sense story-wise, but execution was a little lacking. I do think the post-credit scene, though, is still insanely effective, and was a great way to announce the next show we'll be covering. Unfortunately, I won't have nearly as much to say about the music of this season compared to the last season. It's still done by Ludwig Göransson, although I haven't been able to find much about how he did this season. It also doesn't help that it wasn't focused on in the behind-the-scenes documentary about this season on Disney+. The only thing I can really focus on is the fact that Episode 8 is the first time they fully use a John Williams piece. Of course, it's the Force theme, and it's for Luke Skywalker's appearance. While I personally think the main Star Wars theme would have made more sense, not only because it originally represented Luke, but also because it would still have the idea of music from the mainline series crossing over into this show, but it still works fine. I will say, though, I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, but in Episode 5 when Ahsoka is talking to Mando about Grogu and the Force, she brings up Yoda. When she does this, I swear I can hear the slightest hint of Yoda's theme. I have no idea if it's intentional or not, but it was a cool thing I noticed. A lot of this season was still shot on the Stagecraft volume. Unfortunately, the behind-the-scenes documentary on this season wasn't nearly as in-depth, although there was one highlight. In Episode 7, when it shows what happens when you're seated in the storage area of Slave 1 while it's taking off. There are also moments where handcrafted models and or backgrounds were projected onto the volume, so you'd still get a slightly more practical feel. Other than that, I don't have much to add. Before we get to the big thing, a quick thing I'd like to mention is the Dark Troopers. I didn't realize they were apparently mostly practical. They were actors in suits that were then touched up in post to practically replace their joints and make them look a lot slimmer and more robotic. Okay, now this is gonna be the "why deepfake Luke Skywalker looks bad" portion. Here's the weird thing about Luke in this series. It's still very uncanny, but in the exact opposite direction of CG Tarkin. CG Tarkin was off-putting because it's clear that his entire head was computer-generated. It just didn't look right. Deepfake Luke looks uncanny because it looks too flat and motionless. I think the difference is one is entirely man-made while the other is relying on an algorithm trying to figure things out. Luke's eyes look dead and the lip syncing is terrible. That's mainly because the algorithm can't do the intricacies of eye or lip movement. At least with Tarkin, multiple people probably had to tweak it over months and months just to get it to look right. With Luke, they kinda just fed the program a shit ton of photos of young Mark Hamill and basically called it a day. I think the reason this is so jarring is because of two things. One, the fact that before this, we've had pretty well done ways of de-aging actors. Like some examples that immediately come to mind are Ant-Man 1, Ant-Man 2, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I think some of these effects still hold up somewhat well. I know that what they do for those is different from what was done here, but it's still jarring when it's clear that there's an effective method of doing de-aging like this, and they even had Mark Hamill shoot some stuff for it. The other thing is a fan casting that you might still hear every now and again. People noted that Sebastian Stan doesn't actually look that far off from young Mark Hamill. Not only would it save on CGI, but it also wouldn't yield weird results like this. I'd also like to mention that the voice is fake too. They fed a bunch of ADR of Mark Hamill into a program called Respeecher and let that do all the work. Almost nothing about this performance is real, and that genuinely scares me. Was this nice in the moment? Yeah, but there are much more effective ways to do it. Robert Rodriguez was so excited to work on episode 6 of this series that he planned out Boba Fett's entrance way before production even started. He stuck his kids in Halloween costumes and choreographed the entire sequence, including some shots where he had to use action figures. In the post-credits scene of episode 8, Bib Fortuna is played by Matthew Wood. Matthew Wood also played a younger Bib Fortuna in The Phantom Menace. In order to keep Luke Skywalker a secret, they faked a bunch of stuff to make it look like Plo Koon was actually going to be the one to make a cameo. This involved fake scripts, fake concept art, and even fake previs and a fully rendered Plo Koon head. One reason they chose Plo Koon specifically was because Plo Koon is Dave Filoni's favorite Jedi, so if it got out, superfans would immediately know why it was him over other characters. Let's just ignore he got blown up during Order 66 in Revenge of the Sith. While this definitely isn't a bad season, it certainly feels like a downgrade. It weirdly feels like it's a lot less coherent than Season 1. Season 1 felt like it had a mostly consistent tone, barring moments here and there. But Season 2 feels a little all over the place. There's already a huge difference between episodes 1 and 2, let alone compared to others in the season. It's also not lost on me that episode 5 was basically a backdoor pilot for the Ahsoka series, and how episodes 6, 7, and 8, to a degree, were also all set up for the next series we'll discuss. Season 1 felt like a whole story, basically a glorified 5.5-hour film. This is clearly more episodic in nature, which I don't mind entirely, but I can't pretend I don't have a preference. I'll give The Mandalorian Season 2 a 7.5 out of 10. This show is honestly baffling. No matter which way you look at it, it just seems misguided on what it wants to be. This easily had the potential to be the best Disney Plus Star Wars show so far, and you can see glimpses there, but it was all squandered for one reason or another. Already, I think you can start to see where the flaws are. The first one, outside of the flashback scenes, this show is not that compelling or entertaining. This might also be a personal thing, but I think it would have been cool for basically all of these flashback scenes to have no dialogue, have it be entirely visual storytelling. Especially since George Lucas himself treated Star Wars like it was a silent film where you could understand what was going on even with no sound. I think the highlight from this episode is his escape from the Sarlacc pit. It's very claustrophobic, and it definitely got to me. And I myself am not very claustrophobic, so you know it's bad when even it got to me. This episode was directed by Robert Rodriguez, and outside of the flashback scenes, I don't quite see his style or influence here. I know he has a massive love for this character, but I don't feel it here. Even after rewatching this episode, I barely remember what happens in it. I also think it's interesting that the part that most people commented on when this episode came out was Boba Fett saying,
"Like a panther." Yes?
I remember the Hutt twins and Chrysanthemum being introduced, but other than that, nothing. That's probably not good if I can barely remember what's a seventh of your show. This is the episode where they introduce the Rancor part, which also has a Danny Trejo cameo, which I guess makes sense as this episode was also directed by Robert Rodriguez and their frequent collaborators. This is another one that I don't remember much of. Maybe going episode by episode was a bad idea. I think the most odd thing about this episode is the fact this is the one where they decide to establish why Fennec Shand and Boba Fett work so closely together. Why wait until episode 4? It just seems incredibly odd to me. This is my favorite episode. If you couldn't tell, that's actually a problem. Not because the episode is bad, but because it's the only episode where Boba Fett isn't in it at all. The damn show is called Book of Boba Fett, yet an entire episode is dedicated to Mando. It's not even half an episode or anything. It's an entire 50-minute episode without Boba Fett in it. While I wasn't exactly surprised that Mando made an appearance, I didn't think he would just hijack the fucking show like this, especially since this is a necessary viewing. Bryce Dallas Howard does a good job with this one, but it still doesn't answer why this has literally no Boba Fett in it. This episode is quite possibly one of the most baffling episodes of any Star Wars series. It still follows Mando instead of Boba Fett, but randomly it also decides to spend a long amount of time with Luke Skywalker and Grogu while Ahsoka's just there? Did no one think this was out of place for a show called Book of Boba Fett? Where the hell is Boba Fett? Let's also not forget that it just randomly decides to pull Cad Bane out of its ass. This episode's long and boring, in my opinion. I think it realized it had too many random plot threads that it had to close, so it spent an unnecessary amount of time just trying to answer those. But there's still just so much wrong here. 1. Mando and Grogu are still a bigger focus than they should be. 2. Cad Bane is completely wasted and gets killed off. Like, it isn't even ambiguous. That motherfucker is dead for good. What utter horseshit for such a good character. 3. It also randomly decides to be King Kong in the last 10 minutes. This one episode perfectly encapsulates everything wrong with this series. Chrysanthemum looks pretty good, damn near 1-to-1 compared to his original comic appearance. The Rancor was also pretty interesting in how they did it. In Return of the Jedi, it was actually just a hand puppet. In this one, it was actually a giant practical head and shoulders that they then touched up with CGI, while also having CGI cover the rest of the body. Then there's Cad Bane. Now, I'll admit, this is an entirely personal thing. But I don't like how Cad Bane looks in this show. Now, this isn't just I just have unrealistic expectations when it comes to this stuff. Because I actually think Rosario Dawson as Ahsoka both looks and acts the part perfectly. I'm open to slight tweaks if it works. My problem is the fact that we've already seen Cad Bane's species in live action. Back in 1977! We know what his species looks like in live action, so this is just unnecessary tweaking for the sake of it. This is mostly going to be about Luke Skywalker. I will say that Luke Skywalker does look better here, as they actually worked with someone who used deepfake to better the affected Mando Season 2 on YouTube. However, there's still parts of it that look unsettling. Also, his voice somehow got worse, and it's even more clear that it's artificial, because it just sounds so incredibly monotone. As I'm sure you can tell, I don't care much for this series. It's so perfectly down the middle that I can't give any less of a shit. Even when it first came out, I didn't rush to watch the episodes. I only bothered to catch up on them when I got COVID in early 2022 and figured I'd had some time to kill while I was off from school. There's so much wasted potential here. Why is Cad Bane introduced at the last second? The entire show could have been about their rivalry. Apparently the creators were trying to make this more like a mob movie, but I think they failed at it. With Mando, they replicated that feeling of Western/samurai films pretty well. Here, not so much. In fact, you want to know how bad it was? I never even put together that's what they were trying to do until I watched the behind-the-scenes documentary on it. That's not a good sign. Probably my biggest criticism is this show has a massive pacing problem, and I feel like it doesn't quite know where to put the flashback scenes. I'm going to use an example of what I mean. In the show Daredevil, the first season would occasionally flash back to Matt Murdock's childhood. The thing is, whenever this would happen, it would actually connect with what would happen next. That's how you do effective flashbacks. Here, it feels like they do them just for the sake of doing them, instead of actually trying to explain how Boba was alive after the Sarlacc pit. I'll give the Book of Boba Fett a 6.5 out of 10. While I didn't hate it, it's so unremarkable that I don't even bother with it. It sucks the show is the way that it is, because it seems like most of the cast and crew had a blast making it. Remember back when this show was coming out and all everyone could talk about was how excited they were? This was Disney finally acknowledging the prequels to a much bigger extent than they have before in live action. Obviously there was Clone Wars and Rebels, but I know some people are a lot more skeptical of animated shows, especially ones that are technically targeted towards kids. In live-action projects, the prequels were rarely mentioned aside from Bail Organa and Rogue One and the odd mention here and there. This show was finally answering all the prequel fans who wanted more of that era from Disney, especially as some of the biggest complaints of the sequel trilogy is how much they only focused on original trilogy stuff and not much else, something I actually agree with. Plus, the more we heard about this show, the more people seemed to get excited for it. Ewan McGregor was back, Hayden Christensen was back, the Inquisitors from Rebels were going to be the antagonists, and much more. Then the show finally came out and it was so bland. In fact, I'm going to divert from the topic real quick to mention that this show was so underwhelming that, at the time of writing this, it's been almost 3 weeks since I finished it to actually start writing. It's one of those projects that I just didn't care enough to actually write about. Even the behind-the-scenes documentary I watched, I was just like, yep, that was a thing. That's never a good sign for a project. At least with Book of Boba Fett, there was enough there to write about, even if I still thought the show wasn't that good. Here, I just couldn't care less. I'll still give it the same treatment going episode by episode, but I feel like I can't be bothered enough to go further in depth. I like how this episode shows what Obi-Wan's life on Tatooine was like. At first, it's very repetitive and monotonous, which I feel like makes perfect sense. I also love some of the Inquisitor stuff, especially that one shot where the Grand Inquisitor is giving this whole speech on how a Jedi's compassion is their weakness, and his eyes slowly go from normal to Sith eyes. That's such a cool shot. However, everything else about the episode is fine at best. Except for the ending when Flea kidnaps young Princess Leia. I'll be honest, the very fact that Leia's in this show kind of told me that I was about to see some timeline fuckery. I don't think there's that much noteworthy stuff about this episode. Seriously, I only took 4 notes for this episode, and it's 41 minutes. If I'm watching something and I only jot something down at an average of every 10 minutes, that's not good. It doesn't matter if they're positive or negative notes. At least give me something noteworthy. Hell, one of them's a goddamn joke because something reminded me of Breaking Bad. Although I will say his look of pain at the end of the episode when he found out Anakin was still alive was just so good. Also, Kumail Nanjiani's here, I guess. This is the best one. Like, there's no way it isn't. I think this one episode encapsulates why I think Vader can be so fucking terrifying. Like, this entire episode seems like an extension of the hallway fight scene in Rogue One. Like, the scene with Darth Vader suiting up and the music it plays is so foreboding, and I love it. I also love the genuine fear you can feel from Obi-Wan throughout the episode. Even the end where Vader throws Obi-Wan into a bunch of flames just so he can feel what Vader felt on Mustafar all those years ago was so good. Hell, even the fact he just snapped a child's neck on screen with little effort is just... my god. This episode aimed to make Vader scary again, and I love it. And just like that, we go from the best episode to the worst one. I think the major problem with this episode isn't even the fact that it's bad per se, it's just that it has literally no place in the story. It feels like filler just to make the season 6 episodes, which is such a strange concept to me. 6 episodes is already extremely short for a TV season, and it's not like the episodes are an hour and a half each. The entire show's runtime is just over 4.5 hours. This episode was so unnecessary, I didn't even have anything to write down for over half of it. What I did bother to write down was just stupid shit that's not even worth mentioning. This show is just so odd. Fine enough episode. I like when it flashed back to Obi-Wan training Anakin, although I think it's funny that not only can you tell Hayden Christensen is much older than he was during the prequels, but his voice also got much deeper. Ironically, he sounds more like Matt Lanter, who voiced Anakin in the Clone Wars show. I also love the moment when Vader is able to hold back an entire giant ship by himself. I feel like it's a great showcase of just how fucking pissed off this guy is. I would kill for some sort of spin-off movie with him, but if this shows any indication, I shouldn't get my hopes up if they decide to do it. The first half of this episode I like fine enough. The second half feels too fan-servicey, though. Like, I love the battle between Vader and Obi-Wan. Ewan gives a genuinely fantastic performance here, and I think the emotions are on point. Even the way it's lit with the lightsabers illuminating their faces is just great shit. But this also has Reva's random-ass redemption that comes out of nowhere, and all the fan service bullshit. Like, I didn't need Obi-Wan to say,
"Hello there,"
to Luke, and I didn't need to see Ghost Qui-Gon. While I think it makes sense for Qui-Gon to show up, I kind of liked how mysterious it was what happened between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, and you kind of just filled in the gaps yourself. I feel like not enough people talk about this anymore, but are we going to acknowledge how this show broke canon several times? And it's in the stupidest ways, too. Like, let's start with the whole premise of the show. Obi-Wan rescuing Leia after she was kidnapped. You're telling me that Leia somehow never put together that the Ben that was sent to rescue her was the Obi-Wan she was calling for in A New Hope? She would have known that he was a Jedi, right? How did she not put that together? Second, Vader and Obi-Wan's duel on Tatooine. Did Vader never question why Obi-Wan was on Tatooine? He now knows that Obi-Wan is 100% alive. In this point of the timeline, he also knows Palpatine was mostly full of shit, so he never went back to investigate, or even had anyone else investigate. It also doesn't help that he wasn't the only one hiding on Tatooine. Let's also not forget that it kind of ruins the line in A New Hope when he says,
"I sense something, a presence I've not felt since..."
That hits so much harder when the only context was the prequels and how he was reminded of Mustafar. But now it's just a presence I haven't felt since 9 years ago on Tatooine. The worst part is, in A New Hope, it's implied that Vader thought Obi-Wan was dead. But he should know that he isn't, so why is he so surprised when Obi-Wan is now on the Death Star? Look, I hate being one of those this breaks canon guys because, one, retcons are a very common thing in fiction, especially in big franchises like this. You can't keep track of every single little thing. Something's bound to get lost in the mix. This one show probably broke several pieces of canon, whether it be the comics, books, video games, etc. And two, I find most examples, like some coming up, to be very bare bones and can be explained very easily. The only reason I felt the need to mention it here, though, is because of the fact that you don't even need to watch the spin-off series about Glup Shido in order to find a canon break. You just need to look at A New Hope. You know, only the very first Star Wars movie. It bothers me because of how easy it is to point at and be like, wait, that doesn't add up. Look, I don't analyze Star Wars for a living, as I'm sure you can tell by now. But if even I can point to things that don't make sense, that's when you know you screwed up, because I feel like I'm pretty lenient with this kind of stuff in any franchise, not just Star Wars. The biggest problem with this show is wasted potential. This could have been one of the best shows if they just took the time to craft a good story. Especially since not only are you catering to prequel fans, you're also probably catering to the non-prequel fans. Try to tell them, hey, you may not like the prequels, but here's something around that era that you can still enjoy. Wasted potential seems like a common theme with Disney Star Wars so far. I think it's at its absolute worst in Rise of Skywalker, but I also point to this show as an example because even though I feel like I'm overall mixed on the prequels, I can see why this was so disappointing to literally everyone. I'll give Obi-Wan Kenobi a 6.5 out of 10. Just underwhelming and mostly unmemorable. Remember around the time of early 2022 when there was this promotional image released? This image was used to market the next few Star Wars shows. Remember when all the memes focused on the fact Andor was there and how no one seemed to care about his show? I don't think anyone could have guessed that not only was his show good, but that it would be easily the best out of this entire photo op. Okay, I should probably clarify something before we start the show. While I do think this is a good show, I don't think it's the second coming of Christ like some people act like it is. It definitely has good moments and highlights a part of the Star Wars universe that we'd really only heard about previously, but I'm not going to act like this show saved my cat in a tree or something. Hell, to give a little more context, I didn't even really watch the show when it first came out. I watched the first 3 episodes after they premiered, and I thought the show was really slow, and it felt like it didn't even get going until the end of episode 3. I watched episode 4 shortly after it premiered, and then I just never went back to it. I didn't even fully watch the show until 3 months later when I was super sick and couldn't really do anything, so I just binged it in basically a single day. Within literally the first 5 minutes of the show, it already establishes that it's pushing that TV-14 rating. Like, it literally starts in a brothel. If I remember correctly, this is also the first Star Wars project to officially use the term BBY as a date. Although it says BBY 5 instead of how most people would say it, which is 5 BBY, but whatever. I think this episode builds plenty of intrigue, but most of it is literally just to set up the characters. This first episode should be a major clue to people that this is going to be much slower paced than compared to other Star Wars projects. Honestly, another welcome addition, as I feel like that way it further differentiates itself from the main series of films. I feel like this is when the show starts getting much better, mainly after the character of Luthen is introduced. Although Fiona Shaw as Marva Andor was also pretty good here. Even though she doesn't do much in this episode, I love how you can tell the amount of rage she's holding in. It's only bursting at the seams, but there's still clearly more within. I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, but it's good stuff. This was the episode I had the least to talk about. By that I mean I only wrote down 2 notes, and only one of them is actually something worth mentioning, which is when they start going more into Cassian's backstory and how he was removed from Kenari. I guess it's also notable for having the first swear in Star Wars, that being shit. And before you say anything, I don't count damn, hell, or even ass. I also still feel like the very end of this episode was when things finally started to get going. There's no other way I feel like I can describe it. I don't have much to say about this one either. My notes consist of, wait, Coruscant? They're actually acknowledging the prequels? Cassian shaving his beard, and the fact that Ebon Moss Backrack was in this. Something I completely forgot about until rewatching this show. As I'm sure you can tell, sometimes I'm not the best with note-taking. This is probably when I really started getting into the show. I mean, it's kind of unfortunate that it took a third of the season before it happened, but whatever. I like how it's more just a sit down with these characters, almost like a calm before the storm moment before they actually attempt their big heist. It really delves into why some people are fighting for the reasons they are. Hell, the fact we get multiple perspectives on what the individuals think of the rebellion I find quite interesting. Some fully believe in the cause, while others are still skeptical, but it's better than the Empire. It's just so interesting to me. Probably my second favorite episode in the series. I love the point where they start taking hostages because I almost read it as they didn't exactly know what to do because they never had to deal with this situation before. I also love the spaceship chase near the end of the episode. It's visually stunning and really damn impressive for just a TV show that you're going to drop on Disney+. I think the biggest highlight of this episode was the ending. Not only does it make the Imperial droids genuinely terrifying, especially since really the only experience we have with them is K2SO, but also him going to prison and for the reason to be change of guidelines is kinda scary, even worse with the context of later episodes. Even though I said episode 6 is my second favorite episode, this is probably my favorite overall arc. The prison arc is easily the most compelling part of the season in my opinion. Not only does it bring back Andy Serkis, thank God because he was fully wasted as Snoke in the sequels, but also does a really good job establishing this prison. I also like how different it feels from the other prisons you may have seen in movies and shows. It's more of the prison stuff I like. I also love the scene where Olaf almost faints, and some of the inmates have to make sure he doesn't so none of them get punished for it. It's not only a great tense scene, but also serves as a good reminder of just how fucked these people are. This is the best episode. I'm not even close to the only one that thinks that. The entire escape feels really good to watch. You feel this sense of accomplishment knowing what these characters went through and how they're finally able to fight back. The inmates are running the asylum now and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. But of course, because this show can't be too joyous, when they all get to the door and Kino says, "Can't swim," is just a turn of the knife. Especially considering the speech he gave to all the other inmates for them to break out too. This episode also has the amazing Luthen monologue. This isn't just a good monologue for Star Wars, it's just a good monologue in general. But it's not just about the writing. It's also about the way Stellan Skarsgård delivers it. It's not exactly what he's saying, it's what he's feeling and how much of that is being released when he speaks. There were 2 major things that stuck out to me in this episode. The first is when Luthen has a run-in with the Empire. It's very reminiscent of the scene in Mandalorian Season 2 when Mando has a run-in with the few X-Wing pilots. The other was Cassian reacting to his mother's death. I love the way Diego Luna plays that scene. He doesn't break down crying, he doesn't scream, "No!" or "Why?" Just an acknowledgement, and then he moves on. However, the conversation he has afterwards isn't just as if nothing happened. There's a trembling in his voice, like clearly something's wrong. It's honestly pretty realistic. I like this episode, but I feel like it's kind of weak as a season finale. It felt like it was just to set up a second season. Before you say anything, I know what the original plan for this show was. But there were a few things I thought were interesting. The first being a reference to Canto Bight. The second being when everyone's fighting against the Empire. It's very deliberate in how it's presented. People pushing up against what may as well be riot shields, people being tased, hell, even the one who throws an explosive to blow some others up. This is clearly shot and even structured like some real-world protest footage. Unfortunately, I know it sounded like I didn't have a lot to say, but it's honestly one of those shows where you should probably just watch it for yourself in order to fully understand why it's good. The goal for Rogue One was to make it feel like a genuine war film, right? I feel like this does something similar, but rather than a proper war film, it's more a depiction of what it's like to live under a fascist regime. People hiding their affiliations out of fear of the Empire and what they do. It also explores the Empire in a deeper way. Beforehand, we only got little tidbits. We know how the Empire came to be in the prequels, but we don't know much about how the Empire actually operates. I feel like the show does an amazing job not only showcasing it firsthand, but also puts into perspective why the rebellion started and why it was so necessary. Oh, shit, sorry, I forgot. I can't like this show because of bricks and screws being in it. How could I be so foolish? Never mind, I take back everything I said. 0 out of 10. Okay, in all seriousness, I'll give Andor Season 1 a 7.5 out of 10. A pretty good show and something pretty refreshing for the Star Wars universe. At least in terms of movies and shows, anyway. I think most people can agree this is probably the low point in the series. However, I don't think I'd feel comfortable calling it bad. It's just okay. It's probably the first season that feels like it drags at times just to reach the 8-episode marker. I know I said something similar for Season 2, but tell me in all seriousness that at least 2 of these episodes were actually necessary for the overall story. You know which ones I'm talking about. I actually feel like it's a great start to the season. It picks right back up after Book of Boba Fett, like it may as well be the day after, not to mention the fact it sets up practically the rest of the season in just 1 episode. I know how strange that sounds, but do you know how many shows I've watched where it took like 2 to 3 episodes, or sometimes even a whole ass season, just to get started? It was great at building intrigue for what was to come. It also helps that this was the first of 3 episodes directed by Rick Famuyiwa this season. The other 2 are the last 2 episodes, so it makes sense that you'd want him to both start the season and end it. This is, correct me if I'm wrong, not only the first time we've seen Mandalore in live action, but also after the Great Purge. If I remember correctly, it's also the only time Boba Fett was mentioned in this entire season. It was really interesting to see what Mandalore looked like after the Great Purge. Apparently the production team also got Phil Tippett to help out to design the caves on Mandalore. Going on to the episode itself, I do think it was a little much that Mando sent Grogu to get Bo-Katan to save him. I think this is, ironically, the stupidest thing in the entire show. That's saying a lot considering one of the later episodes. Plus, this is also the first time we actually see a mythosaur in canon. I could be wrong, but from what I remember, this is the first time we see one, let alone in live action. I think the thing everybody can agree on about this episode is the fact that the episode is entirely useless for the most part. Like Book of Boba Fett, it gets completely hijacked by a character that isn't the title character. Now, while I think Book of Boba Fett was a clusterfuck, at least with episode 5 of that show, it focused on a character people actually liked or cared about, and actually paid off. Who wanted a full episode about this guy? What's his name? Dr. Pershing. Shit, I actually forgot that. Apparently a big inspiration for Lee Isaac Chung, the director of this episode, was Alfred Hitchcock. Which I can kinda see, but it doesn't change the fact that it completely diverts from the narrative for almost no reason. In fact, I think it only fully pays off in the last 2 episodes, and even then, it's not by much. I think the best way to describe it is, it's more important for world building of the overall universe than it is for the story of The Mandalorian specifically. I hope that makes sense. It also doesn't help that this is the longest episode of The Mandalorian at 57 minutes. So not only is it the least important of the season, but also the longest, meaning more likely that people will feel like they just wasted their time. Yeah, that was certainly a choice. I remember when this episode came out, and practically the only thing people were talking about was when it covered more of Grogu's backstory, which we really only saw the tiniest piece of in Book of Boba Fett. I don't think anyone could have guessed he was saved by Kelleran Beck. Who is that? I don't know, but he's played by Ahmed Best, the actor who portrayed Jar Jar, so that's cool. Something I found interesting about this episode is that it's the only other episode in the series directed by Carl Weathers, rest in peace. Ironically enough, this was probably one of the most visually impressive episodes, mainly in how Order 66 was handled and shot. A lot of the last episode was shot very matter-of-fact, acting like Coruscant was merely just a location that they happened to be shooting in. However, this episode makes it feel like more the perfect action setting. It's hard to describe, but it's really interesting. Otherwise, the rest of the episode's fine. I still remember when this episode came out, and the biggest talking point was Zeb showing up from Star Wars Rebels. Okay, a few things. One, why the hell is he here? Like, is there any specific reason it had to be him from a story perspective, or was it for nostalgia bait bullshit? Two, he looks weird in live action. I don't know what it is, but characters from the animated shows just apparently don't translate well into live action unless they're Ahsoka. This is ironically one of the few times where him being almost one-to-one with the cartoon makes it look worse, because Zeb's original design was clearly catered to Rebels' style. But here in live action, God, he looks so weird. Aside from that, this episode's alright. It's the episode that shifts course into what the Mandalorian means. During the course of this season, they tried making the Mandalorian mean it's about Bo-Katan rather than Din Djarin. I can see why, as this season is all about reclaiming Mandalore and trying to reinvigorate the Mandalorian culture. It also does an okay job at establishing that the New Republic was not very good at their job. The best compliment I got is that I really liked Gorian Shard's design. I know he showed up in episode 1, but he's featured more prominently here. He's very reminiscent of Swamp Thing, and I love Swamp Thing, so that may also be influencing my opinion. Probably the most polarizing episode in the entire season. Maybe even the entire series. Mainly because of two of the characters in this episode. The Duchess, played by Lizzo, and Captain Bombardier, played by Jack Black. It appears they really left their mark on the show because they're literally only in 2 scenes. Hell, I think Christopher Lloyd has more screen time than them. You know, I actually like this episode. Does Lizzo and Jack Black take me out of it? A little. However, the rest of the episode is pretty interesting, and I kind of like the mystery it sets up, even if it has almost nothing to do with the overall plot of the season. One thing I noticed, though, is that the battle droids sound like the ones from Clone Wars and not the ones from the prequel trilogy. Otherwise, I think the hate for this episode is completely overblown. I'll be honest, I don't remember much about this one, even after watching it recently. I feel like it's just the lead up to the finale. The most I got was this fully explained how Moff Gideon got the Darksaber, how Mandalore went to shit, in more detail anyway, and the fact that Moff Gideon's Mandalorian armor looks like a Dathomirian for some reason. Oh, and I guess IG-12's a thing. I think the most significant thing about this episode is the fact that it finally reveals why Moff Gideon was so obsessed with obtaining Grogu. Granted, it was kind of easy to put together the moment they brought up Grogu's M-count in the last season, which to my recollection is the only time midichlorians have even been brought up in live-action post-Disney buyout. It established that Moff Gideon wanted to clone himself, and not only that, use Grogu's DNA in some way to imbue those clones with the Force. Also, I think this is where Moff Gideon just turns into a fully cartoonish villain. Beforehand, he actually had this presence. Not quite to the same level as Vader, but it makes sense why they hired fucking Gus Fring for this show. But this episode chose to make him overly egotistical to the point of hilarity. Like, it was not so subtly implied that he clearly had an ego, but this episode gave him probably one of the worst lines he's spoken in the entire series.
And the most impressive improvement is that it has me in it.
I also know that Giancarlo Esposito has expressed interest in returning in the series, and even implies he could in the behind-the-scenes documentary on this season. But can we, just not? The man was engulfed in flames, and all his clones were destroyed. Plus, this show could really use a villain change-up by now, and preferably one that has a presence throughout the entire season, instead of just the last few episodes. I also don't hate the way this season ends, but the fact it ends like a Looney Tunes cartoon with that transition is not very helpful, especially for a show that, for the most part, tries to take itself seriously. I think the biggest problem with this season is it's only okay, and not exactly the strongest finish to the series. Now we know this actually isn't the end, as we have the Mandalorian and Grogu spin-off movie, and a possible season 4, I don't know. I hope they handle Mandalorian and Grogu with care, because Mandalorian is one of like 2 of the live-action Star Wars shows that people actually enjoy. I'd hate to see it go further into mediocrity. And hopefully, season 3 of this show is the lowest it'll ever get. Although that new trailer isn't the most promising. I'll give Mandalorian Season 3 a 7 out of 10. Not terrible, but underwhelming considering what came before. Okay, to be fully transparent, this is one of 3 Star Wars projects that I had not previously seen before the making of this video. I'll discuss what the other 2 are when I get to them, but as of now, know that I went into this show for the most part blind. The reason I didn't watch it when it first came out in August of 2023 was because I hadn't seen Rebels yet at that point. I'd seen Clone Wars, but I hadn't had the time to watch Rebels, which I'd heard was very important. Because after I watched Clone Wars, I was going to watch Rebels, but I got 2 episodes in and realized, not yet, I need some time. Unfortunately, I hadn't actually seen Rebels until the beginning of this year in preparation for these videos, and more importantly, this show. I'm glad I did that because, Jesus Christ, this show probably makes no sense if you haven't seen Rebels, and even worse if you haven't seen Clone Wars. Like, maybe a previously on before the first episode would have been helpful for people who either never watched Clone Wars and or Rebels, or for people who just needed a refresher. Okay, I get why you wouldn't because they're animated instead of live action, but still. I love how immediately it's clear this is very different from the other Star Wars shows. Everything has this red text and foreboding feel. It immediately reminded me of the last 4 episodes of Clone Wars, where every episode started with a red version of the Clone Wars logo. Although I will say the title crawl at the beginning made me remember why the title crawls in the main Star Wars movies are the way they are. Because the one in this episode is boring as hell. Aside from this opening, I immediately felt what I believe is an overarching problem with this entire series. Holy shit, this show drags at points. Granted, this is the longest episode, but still, it also doesn't help that I feel like this show doesn't really get started until episode 2. This entire episode concerns itself with trying to show the audience what happened in between Rebels and now, especially with Sabine. It can be helpful for if you needed a bit of a refresher on Rebels, but my god does it really take its time. Otherwise, the last thing I have to mention for this episode is Sabine getting stabbed and somehow not dying. I saw Phantom Menace. A lightsaber stab to the gut is usually not a good sign. Talk about plot armor. Already starting off strong with the episode title being from goddamn Shakespeare. But yeah, I feel like this is actually when the show got started and when it picked up the pace a bit for me. It also made me love Huyang even more than I already did. Granted, that could just be because he was voiced by David Tennant. But I also tend to have an affinity for characters that are just kinda assholes. This is also our first appearance of Chopper in this series. Not his live-action debut, as that was in Rogue One in a blink-and-you'll-miss-it moment, but it's still great nonetheless. This is probably the only character from Rebels that I think was translated perfectly into live-action. The voice, the look, the mannerisms are perfect. This episode also ended with the epilogue from Rebels. Granted, there's a few tweaks, aside from the fact everything's live-action now, but it basically cements how this show is really just Rebels Season 5. I'll admit, most of what I have to say comes from the first few minutes of the episode with Sabine training with Ahsoka. Mainly in when Sabine put on the helmet, she said,
I can't see, how am I supposed to fight?
Sabine, did you forget Kanan Jarrus was blind after Season 2 of Rebels? You trained with him briefly after he became blind. Did you not put 2 and 2 together that might have been how he was able to still do cool shit? I know it's a nitpick, but that line still confuses me so much. Although I also love Ahsoka basically just fucking with her throughout the remainder of the session. Casually pacing around Sabine and just messing with her basically. Otherwise, I don't have much. This was the episode I took the least amount of notes for. Yet another show with the character of Carson in it. This is the major connecting tissue between Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, and this show? Okay. Otherwise, most of what I have to say is ironically about this episode's climax, unlike the last episode, which was only about the beginning. But yeah, Ahsoka throwing Shin into a goddamn rock right on the noggin as well? How the hell did she not have at least a concussion? Of course, there's also her being in the world between worlds from Rebels and Hayden Christensen in this show. Him calling Ahsoka Snips really proved to me how Matt Lanter was accidentally really good casting for Anakin in hindsight, because older Hayden Christensen sounds so much more like him than younger Hayden Christensen did. I already mentioned this in the Obi-Wan section, but this made it even more clear to me. Even before watching the show, I know this was the episode that got the most attention, especially when it came out. Mainly for all the live-action flashbacks to Clone Wars, not to mention how good Hayden looks in the early season Clone Wars look. But I'll also say, I think it's among one of the weaker episodes. Don't get me wrong, it's a little bit more than just, hey guys, we got Hayden back, like they did for the Obi-Wan show. However, I think there's richer episodes in terms of themes and just overall story. We spend a majority of time in the world between worlds and not much focus on what's going on outside of that. It's cool seeing a lot of this stuff, especially in live action, but I think there's far more interesting stuff focused on in other episodes of the show. I feel like the reason episode 5 was super popular when it came out was because of all this cool stuff, but now that 2 years have passed, it seems like no one really cares about it anymore. It was cool in the moment, but that moment has passed. This is the best one. By far. Not only does it establish why every one of the films started with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but it also just has so much ground to cover. The first one being, this is when we finally get to see Grand Admiral Thrawn not only making his live-action debut, but he's also played by Lars Mikkelsen, who voiced him in Rebels. Okay, I may be a little late to this party, but after seeing this episode, and seeing the rest of the series, I really want to see more Thrawn. I'd seen him in Rebels previously, but I also knew he was kind of being held back because of the kind of show Rebels was. Here, however, holy shit. I'm not even kidding when I say that this episode makes me really want to read the novels about him, including the Legends stuff, and I rarely engage with the Legends content that aren't the video games. Side note, Jesus, this guy has a lot written about him. Like, what do you mean he has 3 different book trilogies dedicated to him? Granted, one of them's Legends, but Jesus, man. Something I also love about this episode is Baylan. There were 2 different speeches that I quite liked. The first one describing the constant cycle of good and evil being in power. When I heard it, I immediately thought about how it led to the sequel trilogy. We keep seeing in shows like Mandalorian and this show how the First Order was able to rise. The second speech of his is the whole,
I miss the idea of it.
speech. When I heard it, I was immediately reminded of Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi, only focusing on the Jedi's flaws and hubris that caused their downfall. Granted, one speaking from the perspective of actually being in the Jedi Order and being soured not only by the Clone Wars but the entire reign of the Empire, and the other's a bitter old man who's cut himself off from the Force and his only exposure to the Jedi was 2 old Jedi Masters. The final thing I'll mention is Ezra being in this episode. This technically wasn't the first time we saw him in the series, as we saw a message he left for Sabine in episode 1, but this is the first we see of him in person, and can I say, this casting is really good. Some of the mannerisms, the look, and even the voice a little bit tells me, yeah, this is a grown-up Ezra. Only problem I have is, did the blue contacts he wore have to be that bright? Jesus. Unlike episode 6, I unfortunately don't have a lot to say about this one. The main things I got were, I don't like how C-3PO is accompanied by the main Star Wars theme. Holy hell, guys, there's more you can use that theme for than just shit from the original trilogy. I also didn't like how this exchange went.
Emperor died.
That's what people say.
Oh, fuck you, Rise of Skywalker. And finally, the only mention of Zeb in the entire series. I'll get into this later, but God, that was stupid. I also really love some of the banter Ezra and Sabine have in this episode. Again, very good casting. The main takeaway I got from this episode is, holy hell, I'd kill for a Star Wars horror film. I know they touched on a few of these elements in Clone Wars, and I know there's a few legend stories that are horror stories, but this just proved to me that a horror Star Wars film would go so hard. Other than that, it was an alright finale. I mean, it's cool that Sabine finally was able to use the Force, Ezra reuniting with Hera. Of course, it wouldn't be Ezra if he didn't steal Stormtrooper armor. And a major problem of mine is the fact it doesn't feel like a full ending. It's clear they really wanted a second season to the show, and, well, they definitely got their wish. However, because of that, this season feels almost incomplete, which is really strange considering how it feels like it doesn't cover a lot. My biggest problem with this show, like I said, is its pace. This is the second longest of the live-action shows at a length of 6 hours and 15 minutes, give or take. The only show that beats it, that we've covered so far, is Andor Season 1 at almost 8 hours. There's not a lot in this show that I personally saw that justifies that runtime. This show does have some truly good moments, and like I said, I love how it handles Thrawn, and it also made me actually like Ezra. I always thought he was annoying in Rebels. But it seriously drags at times. I also think the lack of Zeb is really strange for a few reasons. The first one being, this is basically just Rebels Season 5, so his absence is sorely lacking, especially with the idea of the search for Ezra. I think Zeb would have been very important for that. The second thing is, they already made a live-action model of him for his Mando Season 3 cameo. I know they reuse models because it would be far too expensive if they didn't, and She-Hulk exists. You can't tell me this isn't just Hulk's endgame model copy and pasted into the show. And also the trailer for Mandalorian and Grogu came out while I was writing this, so we know Zeb's gonna be in that, but not in Ahsoka? What the fuck? Otherwise, I thought the show was alright. Maybe if I'd seen it back when it first came out, I may have sang its praises a bit more. However, as of now, it's just kind of there. I'm interested in what Season 2 has to offer, but I'm not foaming at the mouth to see it. I'll give Ahsoka a 7 out of 10. So... Okay, Jesus Christ, I get it! Can I actually fucking say something? God damn. Yeah, I still have war flashbacks every time I think of the show and having to navigate discourse around it. So I'll just make it clear what I think about this show right from the get-go. This show is so fucking mid. In fact, I'm just gonna say this now. Why the fuck did this show get so much attention? People, both positively and negatively, lost their shit about the show, and I just genuinely don't understand why. When the series first premiered, I immediately knew that discourse about the show was about to be really, really difficult. I realized this about 10 minutes in, when there's the infamous fire in space. A few things. 1. This show takes place in the universe of Star Wars, a series involving faster-than-light space travel, samurai wizard monks that wield laser swords, cloning, and not one, but 3 space stations capable of complete global destruction. This series has never been concerned with the limitations of our world. 2. While yes, this couldn't happen in real life as there's not enough oxygen in space to sustain a fire, this also isn't the first time this has happened. In fact, there's a few major examples from the first 6 films alone. You know, the ones people consider real Star Wars. 3. Even ignoring the fire in space in previous Star Wars projects, there's one final thing that I've heard almost no one bring up even though it's also present in this very show. I'm gonna play a clip from A New Hope, and I want you to see what's wrong with it. Didn't catch it? Okay, let's try again. Still didn't get it? Okay, let me isolate the part I'm referring to. The sound. Sound can't travel through space for a similar reason fire can't happen in space. There's little to no air for the sound waves to vibrate through. 4. On top of all of that, this is done for story purposes and for the benefit of the audience to understand why a fire is important to Osha's backstory. It was this very moment where I knew that either A, media literacy was just going to go out the fucking window with this series, or B, people were going to engage in bad faith criticism and not properly engage with the show because they had a bone to pick with it for one reason or another. Not even kidding when I say I used how people talked about this moment as a litmus test of whether or not I was going to engage with them when talking about the show. It also doesn't help that most people had almost nothing to say about the rest of the episode. A moment that barely lasted 15 to 20 seconds was the main talking point for this 42-minute episode. You'll find that was actually a common theme with this show. As for the rest of the episode, it's fine. Like, the most exciting thing about this episode was the escape from the ship Osha was on. Even the opening fight scene between Mayan and Dara was just kind of there for me. Although there is something that this show does have a major problem with. Exposition. This show has probably some of the most unnatural exposition I've seen in Star Wars. A lot of the dialogue is exposition that either the audience already knows, or the characters already know, or worse, both. It's very much tell, don't show, when the language of cinema dictates it should be the other way around. If I want to be told their backstories like this, I'll read a damn book or wiki. I'll admit, the most I got for this episode is how Torben is being played by an actor clearly in their 20s when he's supposed to be, at least, in his 40s. But also how this episode introduces Kymir. Although something I forgot was how he has this really weird voice. In fact, that's how I realized this guy was played by Manny Jacinto, also known as Jason from The Good Place, because he sounded almost exactly like that. Here comes part 2 in our saga of a moment that lasted about 20 seconds and became a major talking point for the whole episode. The whole
The power of
scene only lasts 20 seconds. The rest of the scene is mostly just talking. I guess there's another contentious thing from this episode, but I'm actually going to save that for a later episode that elaborated on it. I'll be honest, the biggest problem with this episode is it's just boring. I do think it's the worst episode in the show, but not because of some canon-breaking reasons or the power of many reasons. It's literally just boring, and you could honestly do without most of it, as a good chunk of it is reiterated throughout the series because of the exposition problem I mentioned this show has. A lot of this episode is mainly just to build up for the next episode. Again, this is also another episode where people lost their shit over 2 separate moments that don't even last that long. The first being the appearance of Ki-Adi-Mundi, and the second of Osha asking if one of the people accompanying them is important to the mission. However, people were losing their shit because of how she asked it.
Is he or they with us?
Fucking pronouns!
No, let's not with that shit today, okay? This was truly one of the stupidest things to get upset about. Really? In Star Wars, the universe in which there's thousands, maybe millions of different alien species who aren't guaranteed to follow the same gender norms as humans, I don't care if they did it more subtly in Tales of the Empire. It's such a stupid thing to get mad over in a series like this. Why do I feel like if they watched the episode The Outcast from Star Trek The Next Generation, they'd have a fucking meltdown? I'm actually going to save the Ki-Adi-Mundi discussion for later as well, but there are 2 things from this episode that I actually think are worth mentioning. How May is written in some of this episode, and the death of Kelnaka. Off screen. Some of the dialogue May has is just not good. My immediate example is when she says, "I can't believe my sister is Jedi scum." Are you sure about that? That was like the one thing she talked about in the last episode, and was partially the reason you tried to burn her alive. But also, seriously? Kelnaka was killed off screen? This is only one of 2 Wookiee Jedis we've seen on screen, the first one we've seen in live action, and he's given almost nothing to do. Apparently there was going to be a fight scene between Kelnaka and the Stranger, but they couldn't do it for budget reasons. I hate to say it, but I think this is the best episode, but purely because it's kind of just mindless action. It doesn't make me think all that much about what I'm watching. Although I will say, considering all the poor exposition throughout the show, I'm glad they actually showed how cortosis worked rather than having 3 different spoken explanations for it before we actually see anything about it. It also gives us the reveal of Chimere being the stranger, which, yeah, no shit. I genuinely don't understand why this was kept secret other than for marketing purposes. There's not a lot of questioning who this stranger is, especially as this episode was the first episode that anyone other than May had even seen him. So keeping his identity secret from the audience was stupid, especially as it didn't take much to put 2 and 2 together. Otherwise, there's not much else worth mentioning. I mean, there's Chimere using Tricata to kill Jecki and the small plot point of May and Osha switching places, and I guess a bit of Kylo Ren's theme for Chimere was played for some reason, even though it literally goes nowhere. Okay, I know they did reveal what that was supposed to mean, but obviously it isn't going to go anywhere now. Another in the saga of You Know By Now. Literally the only thing people really talked about it when it came to this episode was just Chimere stripping down and going skinny dipping. Also that infamous audio description on Disney+. But even I'll admit, yeah, there's not a lot in this episode. I mean, it's the first time we got a lightsaber whip in live action. Other than that, I got nothing. Why did I go episode by episode again? This is such an odd episode. Because to me, a lot of this episode kind of just tells you that a good chunk of episode 3 isn't that important in the long run of the show. Seriously, this episode kind of speed runs through the events of episode 3 until it gets to when shit went south. But there was something interesting here that I realized when I watched it. Okay, so one of people's biggest problems with the show was the idea that it broke canon on the idea of being able to create life, mainly with Anastasia and Coral. However, I'm going to actually explain this because this, to me, doesn't seem all that complicated. 1. The fact that apparently there is a vergence in the Force on Brendok, basically a place very strong with the Force, something that's not at all uncommon in Star Wars. And I should actually mention something that I elected to leave out in a previous segment in this series. During The Phantom Menace, a vergence in the Force is actually mentioned. What scene is it mentioned in? The one where Qui-Gon is telling the Jedi Council about Anakin and how strong in the Force he is. I was actually surprised when I rewatched that film and they mentioned it, because for the longest time, I thought this was an element made for the show to explain their decision. 2. They never outright say that they created life. The way they talk about it implies they did, but it's never stated that Osha and May are artificial creations using the Force. However, what they do say is that it's one consciousness split between 2 bodies. 3. This also leads into a reveal that happens in the next episode, which could have major implications given what the rest of Star Wars is about. Granted, this episode does have a few other problems. Mainly in how they tried to make this episode almost like Rashomon, where we see a single event from the perspective of multiple people and we're never quite sure which one is correct. Except that's not true here. While yes, there are certain aspects that might be a bit muddled, mainly in how Sol saved Osha, but otherwise, both perspectives are correct for the most part, because they rarely connect until the very end. This is also where Kelnaka has the most to do. And even then, it's because he was being mind-controlled. They really had a Wookiee Jedi and decided to do nothing with it. Immediately, let's bring up where I was getting at in the last episode. There is a very quick appearance by Darth Plagueis in this show. The thing is, not only is this his first appearance in live action, but basically every other appearance he's had has been non-canon material. So I can't blame the average Joe if they didn't realize this is the famous Darth Plagueis the Wise. Although it does bring a ton of things into perspective. Like 1, Chimere being a Sith, so he had to be trained by somebody, and 2, Osha would definitely be an interesting thing for him to learn about because of what we heard about him in Revenge of the Sith. Now we know somewhere down the line that these two are going to be killed at some point to make room for Palpatine, but it's interesting to see his beginnings, even if they could have made it more clear to general audiences who this guy was and why that shot of him was important. Now for the other point of contention. Osha bleeding a kyber crystal. Now it seems like no matter how you approach this, people will have different reasons for why it can't work. The crystal isn't exposed. Yes, it is. Watch the scene again, and you can literally see the crystal and the part that's sticking out and touching Osha's hand. It can't happen that fast. Even Vader's took time. Because Vader was still conflicted even after all the horrible shit he's done. Osha explained in this very episode that she wasn't able to control her anger and that's why she couldn't become a Jedi. It's literally spelled out for you. Not to mention that right before this, she learned Soul killed her mother, which is kind of a big deal for her. Why didn't Vader's turn red during the events of Revenge of the Sith? Good to know he wasn't a bad guy when he murdered all those younglings. First, we know he bled his kyber crystal after the events of Revenge of the Sith. And second, the out-of-universe reason is for the same reason Luke's saber was green in Return of the Jedi. It's because a red saber would have blended in with the backdrop of Mustafar and may have been a little harder to follow what Anakin was doing during those fight scenes. Also, it's a lot more visually striking when two seemingly good guys are fighting. This was another moment where I could tell if people were watching it from the perspective of watching the show just to criticize it. I already mentioned how I think it's mid as hell, and I'll talk about its faults when I need to, but I also can't pick and choose what I criticize when it comes to this sort of stuff. There's also one big thing this episode does, and it ties into two different topics, so I'll go at them one at a time. Let's start with... This show had met the ire of Star Wars fans that seemed to not know the difference between Legends and or EU, or ones that refused to actually engage with it and either misinterpreted how this show did things or misinterpreted the previously established canon to make this show look bad. Now I need to make something clear. I'm not going to pretend like this show didn't have things that didn't break canon. I'm sure they did, and Star Wars is usually chock full of retcons in the movies and shows alone. I'm sure taking into account all the games and comics and novels or whatever makes it far, far worse. However, there was something interesting to me where most of people's sources for how this broke canon came from Legends, rather than what has been deemed canon. I get the idea of it's canon until deemed otherwise, which is a fair way to look at things, but seeing how people reacted to these changes in the canon really put some things into perspective for me. I'm not going to pretend like Ki-Adi-Mundi's change in age by over a century and how they handled the Jedi not knowing about the Sith's existence wasn't a strange choice. However, I'm not going to lose my goddamn mind because they did decide to change those things. Or worse, actively harass people who change a fucking wiki page just to reflect the new changes. Seriously, guys. What the fuck? I'd actually like to further dig into how the Jedi reacted to the resurgence of the Sith. By the end of the show, they established that there's really only like 2 people who suspect the Sith aren't fully extinct by the end of the show. Everyone else is under the impression that it was just a rogue Jedi, a concept that's not at all new to Star Wars. This also goes into my next point with how this show ends. Probably one of the biggest problems with some of the criticism this show faced, especially involving the canon, is the fact that a lot of people made declarative statements about what the show was and what it was trying to do before it even had the chance to finish. People talking about whether the Sith being around the presence of the Jedi broke canon before the finale came out, which explained why they thought the Sith were all dead in Phantom Menace. How they thought Episode 3 broke canon before it was established in Episodes 7 and 8 how Osha and May were actually made. Overall, criticizing a show like this before it's fully completed its season is how you make yourself look foolish when you're contradicted by the show itself because you never gave it the chance to actually tell its full story. Now, this is something that's not limited to this show. It's something I'm unfortunately seeing more and more nowadays. Shows that tell their story in serialized formats that are being judged prematurely rather than viewing the whole story and judging it like that. Basically, if someone watched only 30 minutes of a film and criticized it as if they watched the whole thing. It also doesn't help that a lot of people that were doing this because they wanted this show to fail. I cannot begin to tell you the amount of people who wanted this show to fail for one stupid reason or another. For example, people losing their shit when Charlie Barnett incorrectly stated Anakin Skywalker blew up the Death Star. Twice. Charlie Barnett wasn't the only one this happened to. Anyone who was a part of this show's production was under a microscope. People were waiting for one of the actors or creators or whoever to slip so they had another thing to say, "Look guys, they don't know what they're doing!" What I'm trying to get at is people went into it expecting something god-awful, and refusing to let the show do anything to change that. Like I said, this is not limited to The Acolyte. In fact, I'd argue this is quite common for a lot of media properties nowadays, where people try to only look for the absolute worst in any news, trailers, promos, or whatever the fuck. People refused to give it a chance, and still refused even while currently watching it. Rather than wondering why that change may have been made, both in universe or out of universe, it was just met with, "They're trying to erase Legends/EU," or "They're trying to erase George Lucas's Star Wars." And I haven't seen a lot of other people try to ask why that change was made, other than one of those two answers. The final thing that made me realize why this show was never going to be looked at in a proper critical light was when it was, for the most part, cancelled. When a show like this gets cancelled, theoretically speaking, we should be disappointed that rather than taking an opportunity to listen to the criticisms of the previous season and seeing what you can do with that, it just got shot dead in the water. However, when the show was cancelled, it was met with a bunch of "we won." That tells me that some people were never in it to properly give it a chance. They wanted to see failure from the very beginning. Now, I'm not saying you have to love everything, or really anything, that these guys put out. What I am saying, though, is if you don't think you're going to enjoy it, just don't watch it. Don't talk about it like you understand what it's about, and don't celebrate it when it gets shot down. Especially as there's no guarantee that they're going to follow the trajectory that you want them to if they canceled the thing you didn't like. Let's also not forget the constant review bombing of episodes that weren't even out yet, and the fact that some of these idiots were too blinded by hate that they started review bombing the wrong fucking thing. I should make it clear, I still think this show is just okay. I don't think it's great, and I don't think it's terrible either. I'm not defending the show itself, I'm attacking criticism made in bad faith, whether intentional or not. It's why I commonly like watching videos of people debunking other reviewers when they themselves don't like the movie or whatever that's currently in discussion. Overall, I just don't understand why this show is the one people decide to get up in arms about, both negative and positive. But now that it got basically cancelled, we know it's not going to go anywhere. In fact, knowing Disney, the most we're going to get in reference to this show is small references or mentions, or maybe a non-canon LEGO special for whatever reason. I'll admit, there are a few cool things about the show that I would have liked to see go somewhere. Maybe not in an Acolyte Season 2 per se, but just something so I'm not questioning what happened with Osha or Chimere and how that relates to Palpatine or Plagueis. I'll give The Acolyte a 6.5 out of 10. God, this is exhausting. This is the second Star Wars project I hadn't seen before the making of this video. The reason I didn't get around to this one is actually because I was making a previous video, mainly my absurdly long 2024 video. Jesus Christ, I need to learn how to shut up. Just ignore the runtime of this series so far. But yeah, me working on that video caused me to miss out on this series when it premiered, along with missing last year's seasons of Futurama and a number of other things. The interesting thing about the show for me was I heard practically nothing about it except for it's inspired by Goonies and other Amblin Entertainment films, and it was apparently pretty good. I hadn't heard much else about it until I finally watched it for myself. I'm so glad I somehow didn't get spoiled for this show because it might be my second favorite live-action Star Wars series. Something I find funny is this is probably one of my least favorite episodes as I found it to drag a bit. In fact, to bring it back to Goonies, Mikey and the rest of the Goonies only started looking for One-Eyed Willie's ship after about 20 minutes of runtime. This entire first episode is 48 minutes. Also, funnily enough, the longest episode in the series. There are definitely a few points where it drags, and I found there were a few points where they could have fleshed out At-Aten some more, or some of the characters. KB, for example, is barely in this episode, even though she's one of the 4 main characters in the show. Now yes, it makes sense for most of the focus to be on Wim, especially as he's the reason they even get caught up in this mess. But I feel like some fleshing out of the other characters would have been nice. Aside from that though, I do think it's a great introduction and really sets up the rest of the show pretty well, especially when you realize that the Jedi Temple in the beginning isn't a Jedi Temple, but a starship. I also thought making the holiday special fully canon with the hologram circus performance being shown in this episode really took me out of it for a second. Why couldn't the holiday special stay in almost canon limbo like it previously was? I remember when I finished episode 1, I was a little more worried about the rest of the series and started thinking about why I didn't hear much about the show and that it might have just been mid as hell and entirely forgettable. But this episode turned it all around for me. Not only does it do an interesting job at establishing why they can't immediately get back to At-Aten, but also does a pretty good job fleshing out the thread of the show, because we really only had the cold open to the last episode before it. The main thing I love about this episode is how much it fully establishes just how sheltered these kids were. The fact they didn't even realize that there were 1,000 worlds and didn't even know that Alderaan blew up. They didn't know there was a war or even that the Republic technically didn't exist for give or take 23 years. I know this is going to be a really strange comparison, but bear with me here. In the game Final Fantasy III, spoilers by the way, if you care, we find out in the story that the world we'd been exploring for the last little bit was actually just a floating island above a flooded planet. There's not much in the game that sets this up until you get your first airship, and you can leave this floating island. Eventually, you're able to drain the rest of the planet to reveal the rest of the map, but there's just this initial shock of realizing how much of the world you'd actually been exploring. That's how I imagine these kids felt. The most they'd heard of things like the Jedi or Republic were from outdated sources, and they didn't even know what was going on outside of their planet. They even make it a point in this episode that At-Aten is really just boring. Something that's even reflected in the set design to make it look like how Earth is usually depicted in futuristic settings and other sci-fi stories. Basically, they make it boring for the audience as well. I also love how they fully start hinting at Jod's questionable morals. I feel like it was kind of obvious that Jod was the pirate captain that was betrayed in the cold open of episode 1, but I love how they didn't just make it so the kids never found out, but there'd be scenes of him being all sinister in private. I love how even from this episode, they question him quite often. I love some of the character work they give to Neil. Neil is probably my favorite character in this show, not only because I love his design and how much it reminds me of Max Rebo, but I also just love his character. I love how juxtaposed his naivete is with the situation going on. I love the little talk he has with Haina where he thinks the way they can end this conflict is by just apologizing, when, unfortunately, it's not that simple. I also love how at the end, it has Neil finally doing something instead of just cowering like he normally did. Although I did still laugh, admittedly, when he fainted after SM-33 was deactivated. I'll admit, the most I really got out of this episode is that it's directed by Jake Schreier, the guy who directed Thunderbolts recently. I guess it's also the first time we see a lightsaber in this show. There's also a sequence that was very reminiscent of Indiana Jones with that whole acid room scene. The setting, the build-up with the music, the delayed reaction of if what they did it worked or not. It felt very reminiscent of the Golden Idol scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Only difference is throwing the credit into the acid actually worked instead of backfiring. This episode just kind of blew by for me. By the end of it, I realized I barely wrote anything about it in my notes. It just breezes by and mostly only focuses on Wim and KB, probably because KB still hasn't had all that much to do. I thought it was an interesting look at some of these characters, and the ending where they have to separate the ship was kinda cool. Otherwise, I feel like there's not much else to talk about. I do feel like with this episode, it feels like they're trying to rush things a little bit. I honestly feel like this and the finale should have just been combined into one massive episode because of how weirdly rushed these individual episodes feel. Like Brutus being disposed of kind of underwhelmingly. Now, I might be biased because I quite liked Brutus's design, and being able to bring back the Shistavanen after the last notable one, for me anyway, was cut from A New Hope and later re-releases. The opening felt cheap because of how the last episode ended with Jod drawing his lightsaber. And then there wasn't anything to properly follow it up. He just drew it for shits and giggles and for an artificial cliffhanger. I feel like this episode really falls short because it somehow both feels rushed and drags at times. The worst part is it ends so abruptly. There's barely any falling action. I know it sounds cliche and overdone, but I would have liked to see a quick segment of them after the fact, where you see how they've grown as characters and also their connection. Also because admittedly, there was a part of me that was curious about the whole Neil has a crush on someone in his class thing that was just completely dropped after episode 1. Seriously, it was never mentioned again. Runa who? I have no idea why I got so into this show. Maybe I'm just so used to these Star Wars shows being only good for the most part, and that they don't do anything all that different. So then, the moment something even remotely different comes along, I'm super invested. I do admit that it has some major pacing issues, and there's another part of me that wonders if it would have done better as just a 2-hour film instead, but otherwise, I quite enjoyed this show, and I'm a little upset at myself for waiting so long to watch it. I'll give Skeleton Crew an 8 out of 10. This might just be me, but I did not care for this season much. I'm not sure if it was just burnout because this is the last thing I had to watch for this series, but it definitely didn't do it for me. This is the third and final Star Wars project I didn't watch until the making of this video, mainly because I was busy making this series, especially back when it was just going to be one big video. Man, that would have been a terrible idea. Immediately, you may be wondering why I'm not going episode by episode. One, I realized way too late I should have been doing it in chunks anyway, because sometimes I have very little to say, and I imagine hearing over and over again got annoying. Plus, every 3 episodes is its own arc, so it just makes it easier for myself. I was immensely worried when watching these episodes because I was not engaging with them the same way I did with Season 1. I think the part where Cassian is stuck on Yavin with all those dumb rebels was the most tedious. Like, Bix dealing with her PTSD and Mon Mothma at the wedding had interesting moments, but weren't enough to ward off how much I didn't like the stuff actually happening on Yavin. Also, I feel like if I just ignore it, then people might ask about it in the comment section, so I'm going to put up a trigger warning. Just skip to the timestamp if you'll have any problems. So, this was basically the only thing I'd heard about when it came to Andor Season 2. The conversation was all on the attempted rape scene. When I first heard about it, they didn't even exactly mention what it was. It was a post on Threads that just said something along the lines of, I wasn't expecting the R word to be used in Star Wars, and naturally, I thought they meant this one. But the further I looked, I realized what they meant, and without having watched the episodes yet, I had no idea how to feel. What do you mean that's in Star Wars? I was still kind of mixed about it until I actually saw the scene for myself, naturally a little worried on how it was handled, and I think it has that perfect balance of it's brutal, but doesn't go too far. It's not there for shock value, it's built up to from the last episode, and doesn't fully follow through. Mainly because the show needs to remain TV-14. Plus, it keeps in tradition with the show highlighting how awful the Empire is by drawing real-world parallels with other fascist regimes. That being how people would abuse their power by having their way. There's also the other thing where, since it's being intercut with drunk Mon Mothma dancing at the wedding, it also shows how the different classes were treated under this regime. Probably could have picked a less awkward scene to intercut it with, but it gets the point across. I know there's this question of, should this even be in Star Wars? Especially knowing how George wanted it to overall be for kids. But every time I hear that question, I always come to the same conclusion. This is Andor. This show is oriented for much older audiences and has been since the very first episode literally started with him going into a space brothel. I don't think the question should be, should this be in Star Wars? The question should be, does it handle the topic well? Now, I should state that I can't personally answer that. I'm not going to act like I know the do's and don'ts on how to portray this. I feel like that's up to the viewer to decide. However, I will say this. Using this scene to defend the Empire for a show that does basically nothing but show how awful the Empire actually was is certainly a choice. Now, this is another problem that I and many others have with this season. The fact it covers 4 years of content in the span of 12 episodes. The biggest thing for me is the fact that you don't really feel that passage of time. That could just be because the first season was one continuous story that didn't have any yearly gaps, but if they didn't have those title cards, you wouldn't be able to tell how many years passed in the first place. Hell, there's even a joke later in the season where they just say, a lot can happen in a year. And you don't feel that at all in these episodes. The characters basically don't change in those gaps. It doesn't feel like there's many changes in relationships, character, or really anything. Now, to get into this arc specifically, yeah, this was probably the least interesting arc in my opinion. Over the course of these 3 episodes, I don't have much material. I like how we get more insight into Cyril and him being a little more critical of the Empire. I like how Bix got revenge on the guy who tortured her last season, and that's been causing all her PTSD for the past few episodes. And I think this is when they introduced Bail Organa into the show, who's definitely not Jimmy Smits. Otherwise, I don't have a lot. Of course, this is the Gorman Massacre. The only other thing I'd really heard before watching it, and I see why it was talked about so much, that was certainly a sequence. It also shares a lot of similarities with the Season 1 finale on Ferrix, mainly in how a lot of it kind of looks like how recordings of protests look, more importantly, the ones that got violent. But it goes so much further than that. It's not just the build-up throughout the season, it's also the duel Cassian and Cyril have in the middle of all of it. Throughout the season, you expect Cyril to maybe join the rebellion after how he was treated, but his pride got in the way, and he had to fight the one person he thinks ruined his life. Only for that person to not even remember who he was. Ouch. And, on top of all of that, he gets shot in the fucking head right afterwards. This arc also has episode 9, which, I'm not gonna lie, was the only episode I fully enjoyed in the season. There wasn't a dull moment for me when I watched episode 9. The tension, the music, the dialogue, the speech? Immaculate. This is probably my favorite arc from the show, but I can't pretend like I loved it all the way through. Episode 10 was interesting in the fact that I'm pretty sure Cassian wasn't even in it. Also how it portrayed Luthen and his past, even if I didn't like the de-aging effect. But there were still a few times where I didn't quite like it and thought it was a little boring. Episodes 11 and 12 didn't really work for me either. I liked a lot of the K2SO stuff, but he was my favorite character in Rogue One, so that's not exactly a surprise. But a lot of it just felt rushed, and especially the last 15 minutes or so of the series finale, making it feel like every domino had to be in place for Rogue One, also didn't really work for me. I know I didn't have a lot to say, but I just don't know what to think. This season somehow feels like it's both rushed and drags at the same time, and I have no idea how to describe it. We may not fully know the extent of the plans for the original seasons 2 through 5 were, but if this is, what I'm assuming, the best arcs they had in mind for each, I'm not sure how I would have felt. I greatly prefer Season 1 to this, and I'd even rather rewatch Rogue One over this. I'll give Andor Season 2 a 6.5 out of 10. Not sure if I'm just burnt out or this season just wasn't really for me. Might never know unless I rewatch it at some point. Okay, just quickly, I'm going to rank all these before I get to the main thing. 23, the holiday special. Just bad and has no entertainment value other than sheer confusion and anger. Still annoyed at how this special is basically canon now. Just 97 minutes of Wookiees screaming at each other, and it isn't a fun viewing for any holiday, let alone Star Wars. 22. The Rise of Skywalker. Very weak finale to not only the sequel trilogy, but the Skywalker saga as a whole. Its contempt for the previous entry and clear lack of direction on where anything wants to go, along with a random resurrection of the main villain from the first 6 films, leaves me perplexed and annoyed every single time I watch it. 21. The Clone Wars movie. Barely even a movie, just an arc from the Clone Wars show that got a theatrical release for some reason. There is a reason I tend to skip this one in my rewatches of these films. I'd much rather just watch the show and even recommend that you do the same. 20. The Phantom Menace. Now we're in the everything after this is at least enjoyable part of the ranking. But admittedly, I still don't love Phantom Menace. Like I said, I didn't even have that much of an appreciation for it until the rewatch I did for this series, and even then I thought it was only okay. Not sure how I'd feel if I started my next rewatch with this one. But either way, still not quite my thing. I'd rather watch Star Trek. 19. The Acolyte. Oh boy, this one's bound to piss some people off. The problem with the show is just that it's mid. I just think it's exhausting to talk about it because it's another one of those projects where people are super inflammatory over it, whether it's positive or negative. 18. Book of Boba Fett. Boring and forgettable except for when Mando hijacks the show. Also, killing off Cad Bane in a super underwhelming way was definitely not how I would have wanted that to go. 17. Andor Season 2. Just wasn't engaging for me, and I thought very large chunks of it were incredibly boring. 16. Obi-Wan Kenobi. The problem with this one is just that it's pretty forgettable. At the time of writing this, I don't remember practically anything about the show. 15. Attack of the Clones. This one is half actually really good and interesting, and half whatever the fuck this love story is. 14. Ahsoka. Really interesting stuff, but also kind of drags. Although they found a way to make Ezra actually enjoyable and not annoying, so there's a plus. 13. Rogue One. Interesting idea and concept, although even to this day, I don't quite enjoy it until it gets to the battle on Scarif. 12. The Last Jedi. This is definitely the longest of any Star Wars film, and it shows. Finn's storyline isn't really needed, Poe's is just moronic, but Rey and Luke's is so good that it kind of helps make up for it. Like I said, I would love to see Rian Johnson come back to Star Wars completely disconnected from the main series. 11. Solo. Still enjoy this one. Makes some interesting decisions and is overall just a fun side story that, apart from that stupid ending, you could watch without having seen another Star Wars project and you'd theoretically be fine. 10. Mandalorian Season 3. A big step down from the previous 2 seasons, but I still wouldn't call it bad. 9. Andor Season 1. The first of the actually pretty good part of this ranking. A bit of a slow burn that might not work for everyone, but still a pretty good watch. 8. The Mandalorian Season 2. Not as good as Season 1, but still a good season. 7. The Force Awakens. It is basically just A New Hope again, but I still find it incredibly enjoyable, but I admit this is probably due to nostalgia. 6. Skeleton Crew. An interesting look at the Star Wars universe inspired by Goonies. Has a few pacing issues, but it's still pretty entertaining. 5. Revenge of the Sith. This truly shows the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker, but it still has a few of the same problems I have with the other prequels, although this is easily the best one. 4. The Mandalorian Season 1. Really cool look into how bounty hunters operate in this universe. 3. A New Hope. Do I need to explain this one? 2. Empire Strikes Back. Again, do I need to explain this one? And 1. Return of the Jedi. I already stated this was my favorite. This shouldn't be a surprise. Well, here we are. The end of the road for all the projects I was planning on covering. But I didn't title this series, I reviewed every Star Wars project, or some shit like that. I named it, Why I Dislike Being a Star Wars Fan. There's a very good reason for that. I didn't do it just to clickbait you guys, although I should have made it more clear that it wouldn't really go into effect until this part. That's on me, guys. I apologize. But there's a simple answer and a very long answer. Or more like, it's the same conclusion, but one has a lot more elaboration and nuance. I also admit that I haven't been very subtle about it either, so here it goes. The main reason why I dislike being a Star Wars fan is... Okay, now that I've already pissed a few of you off, let me elaborate because it's a lot more nuanced than I'm making it sound. So I'd actually like to give some context and a little behind-the-scenes look behind the series. So, this was originally going to be one giant video. However, I realized far too quickly that it would have been unmanageable, and I wouldn't have been able to get it out by the time I wanted. So when I realized I was going to make this a series, it was a load off of my back, especially when I took a small break to work on the first half of my DCEU series. So the interesting thing was, as I was working on this series, mainly the first 2 parts and even bits of the last part, I was actually really enjoying myself, especially in learning all the behind-the-scenes stuff about these films. I've always loved looking into filmmaking ever since I was like 9 years old, so this was probably one of the most exciting parts of the process for me. Then, there was a little thought in the back of my mind, a thought that persisted for quite a while, mainly in how I don't think I actually dislike being a Star Wars fan, and I just let a few bad apples get to my head. So the plan was that I was going to keep the title, however, I was going to explain all of this as a reminder of how I went into making the video, mainly as like a snapshot of what my thought process was. However, something changed. It's the one reason I'm really glad I made this a series instead of just dropping it all at once and dipping, aside from the fact I would have been drained once I was done making it. I released the second part about the prequels, and I suddenly remembered everything. I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. Now I need to make something clear. Not all the comments under that video are bad. Far from it. There are quite a few that had actual thoughtful criticism of what I was presenting. I even acknowledged as such when I replied to them. The main examples I'll use are further elaborating on why I wasn't the biggest fan of Phantom Menace and why I made the Star Trek comparison. And the person who thought my examples for tonal issues in Revenge of the Sith was slightly disingenuous. I admit I should have been more clear and picked better examples to prove my points. I fully admit that. However, there were a few others that did one of 3 things. 1. Didn't watch the video fully. I know this because one guy even said as much and still decided to make all these declarative statements about me as if he had any context or proof other than, "Trust me, bro." 2. Didn't engage with the video properly and misconstrued a lot of what I said in order to make me look bad. Or 3. Just went out of their way to not engage at all and just cause chaos. For example, shout out to the guy who thought I couldn't be a Star Wars fan because I was also a fan of Star Trek. Good thing I didn't mention Doctor Who, or Planet of the Apes, or Transformers, or Alien, or Futurama, or Godzilla, or Dune, or Frankenstein, or War of the Worlds, or... Do you understand how stupid that sounds, saying you can't like one thing because you like something else that's in the same genre? Or there was this one guy who kept spamming the same copy and paste comments about why the prequels are great, or why the special editions are actually good. And when I tell you it was a problem, I mean it was a problem. There was one point where when I finally blocked them from my channel, literally half of the comments got deleted. It was over 200 comments, by the way, and it got basically slashed in half. It actually got to a point where I was considering leaving a pinned comment actively mocking anyone who did that. I decided not to because it didn't become that big of a problem, but I shouldn't have had to do that in the first place. All over the fact we disagreed on the quality of some films. Another common comparison I heard was the Red Letter Media reviews for the prequels. Now I made this clear in my comments, but I guess I'll say it here just to make it absolutely clear. I had not seen the Red Letter Media reviews of the prequels before the making of my video. I have seen all of them since then, and... yikes. See, those reviews are actually fucking terrible. Okay, only barely related tangent, but have any of you guys who were saying this actually watched these reviews? Or at least in recent years? Because Jesus fucking Christ, they are a pain to sit through. Number one, they kind of take the CinemaSins approach and more use these films as an avenue to make jokes nobody laughed at. Especially since those jokes are definitely baked in late 2000s internet humor where it was funny to be edgy. Seriously, these reviews suffer from jokes that go on way too long and nitpicking every single tiny detail of them to death to make them look bad. Something that, to this day, still happens, especially with Star Wars. Some of the points they do make are so laughably stupid that it hurts or comes from the whole, the audience expects every character in the film to have the same knowledge they do kinds of criticism, which, in most cases, never holds up to scrutiny. Even then, some of the criticisms we did share, they either did it for the sake of a bad joke, or were for completely different reasons. Look, I'm not going to pretend like I'm free from fault, but I was a lot more kind to these films than this dumbass ever was. But there's one last thing I don't think enough people realize. A lot of the talking points in these reviews were kind of the general sentiment regarding the prequels around the time. Awkward dialogue, overuse of CGI, bad acting, bad writing in general. These were opinions that were generally held by the public. These videos tried offering an explanation to why that was for anyone that may have not been able to entirely figure it out, to which they did poorly. Hell, if you want evidence, I already mentioned it before in this series, but watch the documentary The People vs. George Lucas. It highlights a lot of interesting things about not only George Lucas, but how Star Wars fans were, and arguably still are. It was a really insightful watch, and it's clear to me that a lot of people haven't seen it. And really fucking should. Basically, that last point boiled down to, I get it's easy to have a scapegoat, but there's a wider picture to this. RLM was just a small piece to that. Okay, back to the issue at hand. The comments under that video immediately reminded me why I titled the series what I did, and the notion I went into making the series with. Hell, it influenced the writing of the last part in this one, because it's the one thing I've hated ever since I actually bothered to start interacting with the fandom. Like I said before, I'd only heard a lot of it in passing and never dealt with it head-on. I knew the prequels generally weren't liked up until around 10 years ago, and I knew that The Last Jedi had a very mixed reception, and I knew there were people who thought the sequel trilogy was just irredeemable dog shit. I never fully knew the extent, however, until I started interacting with the fandom. There's one specific interaction that, to this day, I still think about, all because I thought someone was being overdramatic. It was under an Instagram post around 2 years ago. Now, I'm not going to tell you who this person was or show what their post was, mainly because I don't want to give this guy any more attention than I'm already doing. So basically, what it was a recreation of old propaganda material from World War II with Star Wars discouraging people going to see the new Jedi Order film they're making. They also inaccurately called it Episode 10. So naturally, seeing something I thought was stupid, I wrote, "Are we really that upset about Star Wars that we're starting to make propaganda? What has this fandom become?" To which I got a response that read, "It's become sick and tired of some greedy corporation running the IP into the mud with their garbage content." This is when I fully break down some stuff. I responded, "What's happening to Star Wars is no different than what's happening to Marvel or DC or basically anything else right now. And last time I checked, we haven't started making propaganda for those. Yet. While I admit Disney Star Wars hasn't been great, doing stuff like this is what makes me hate this fandom. Star Wars is not going anywhere else. Disney is not stupid enough to sell the rights if one movie doesn't do well. I hate to break it to you, but I don't think any other company would treat this any better. It doesn't matter if it would be with Disney, Warner Brothers Discovery, Universal, Paramount, or Lionsgate. This franchise was bound to have this happen, and no matter who it's with, the one and only goal will be money." This next part is why I brought this up, because it's still something I always see when discussing this kind of stuff. They responded, "Disney is making garbage Star Wars, the fans are upset, so behaving accordingly, and you hate the fans? Well, sir, on behalf of the fandom, fuck you and Disney. We have no need of your spineless, subservient flesh around these parts." Not expecting such a harsh reaction, I responded, and this was the last time I replied to this guy in particular, I say that Disney Star Wars isn't good, and yet you think I'm a subservient? This is what I mean by I hate this fandom, because it's nothing but pure hatred and complete disregard for someone who dares to have a different opinion. They responded one last time, but the damage was done already, so I didn't bother. They said, "You can have whatever opinions you want, but to come here blaming the fans is some BS I can't abide by." No admitting of fault, no apologizing for literally cussing me out because I said something they didn't agree with. They just wanted to believe what they wanted to believe about me and ran with it. Didn't even apologize for it when I called them out. Stuff like this is something I see constantly in this fandom. In fact, here's a weird, maybe not so fun fact about me. I don't tend to block people based on what their opinion is in a certain fandom. I tend to think it's incredibly stupid. However, there are only 2 fandoms I've ever felt the need to block someone for. The first one are Snyder cultists. The second, you guessed it, this fandom. In fact, this interaction reminded me of probably the most insufferable ones, and I find unfortunately the most common. I mean this in the most respectful way possible. I'm immediately going to disregard whatever you say if you try unironically using this argument. I fucking hate the idea of a real fan of really anything, but Star Wars fans are probably the worst with it in my experience. Because it's usually some variation of blah blah blah, George Lucas Star Wars is the only Star Wars, or Legends/EU is the only canon extended universe content, or Disney Star Wars isn't canon because insert arbitrary reason here. And it amazes me how no one realizes how insane that sounds. If there's one thing I hate in fandoms, it's fucking gatekeeping. You're gonna try to gatekeep fucking Star Wars of all things? Star Wars. You know, one of the biggest media franchises ever. You're gonna try gatekeeping that? Yeah. Good luck, buddy. I just absolutely cannot stand this kind of behavior because I think it's elitist garbage and no one should be thinking of themselves in that way. Respectfully, you're not going to look cooler just because you didn't like a movie others did, or vice versa. You just look like a douchebag when you try claiming someone isn't a Star Wars fan over the most arbitrary bullshit. Like also being a Star Trek fan, for instance. Okay, that's the last time I'll use that, I promise. I need to make something clear. If you like the prequels, that's fine, you do you. If you like the sequels, that's fine, you do you. If you hate everything from Star Wars except the goddamn holiday special, then fine. You do you. What I can't stand are people who think they're better than you because you don't fall under their rigid definition of what a real fan is. For example, there were people who thought I hated the prequels because I didn't fully agree with them on their quality, even though if they were paying attention, I gave them a 6, 6.5, and an 8 respectively. The only film I rated negatively in that video was the Clone Wars film. In case you weren't paying attention, that's an average of 6.83 repeating out of 10 for the prequels. That's not a bad score, but because I didn't fall under what their perception of a Star Wars fan was, they thought I hated everything about them, or even one guy who thought I didn't understand them, which is honestly an even bigger insult to make yourself look more intelligent because you understood very easy films to understand. I should also mention another type of comment that I got, one that I also feel like I need to explain in detail. To put it bluntly, Star Wars is one of the closest franchises I hold to my heart. It's one of the first franchises I distinctly remember watching basically in full as I was growing up. Star Wars is literally what got me into filmmaking, as when Force Awakens was coming out, I'd start looking a lot more into the special effects work, the soundtracks of these films, the storytelling, and much, much more. I literally wouldn't be who I am without Star Wars. I wouldn't be doing what I want to do if it weren't for Star Wars. I can't just leave. It's one of those things that's a lot easier said than done. In fact, I'm going to give you an example of a fandom I left for various reasons. So, when I was younger, I loved Harry Potter. I thought it was really cool and really interesting. However, over the years, and more importantly how J.K. Rowling is as a person, made me fall out of love with the series. Even then, that was a several-year ordeal. I didn't just get up and go. It still took some fighting. Give or take about a year or two of it, probably more. The absolute main reason I dislike being a Star Wars fan is because I still love Star Wars, but I don't like being associated with the kind of fans it's garnered. I don't want to be associated with people who thought it was okay to harass actors and or actresses just because they were in a project they didn't like. I don't want to be associated with people who think that if someone isn't a part of their hive mind of what a real fan is, then they have a right to insult and demean people. I don't want to be associated with people who do nothing but spread hatred and lies just because they don't like some of the newer stuff. I watch Star Wars to have fun, unless it's Andor. I watch movies to have fun. I make videos about said movies to have fun. I hate when that fun is being taken away from me or others over the stupidest reasons. Now there's one thing I need to make insanely clear, just in case for the people in the back who think I'm generalizing. I'm not saying the fandom as a whole is like this. Not at all. However, I bring it back to the analogy I used earlier on when I believed a few bad apples tried ruining my experience with Star Wars. See, that saying is actually cut in half. The actual saying, in full, is, a few bad apples spoil the bunch. Again, for the people in the back, a small number of people who act like this can still have dire consequences on the rest of the fandom. Now I need to state, if you disagree with any of the opinions I shared about the shows or movies in this series, but still let it slide, you're not who I'm talking about. You're fine. However, if you are getting extremely angry or upset at what I had to say, and even more so when giving examples of what I don't like about the fandom, then I want you to look inwards on why you think that way. Because chances are, you behave exactly like how I described, and you didn't like the idea that I just called you out for your bullshit. Unfortunately, though, I'm sure there are people who didn't even make it this far into the video and still felt the need to bitch and moan about stuff I never said, or assuming things about me with no evidence, or even being disproven by this very video. I love Star Wars. There are very few Star Wars projects I actively despise. I'm always going to love this franchise. I'll probably watch Mandalorian and Grogu when that comes out. I might check out Ahsoka Season 2 when that comes out. There's still a good chance that I will check out whatever Star Wars has in store next. I just don't love how everywhere I go, I see this constant infighting over a series of movies, books, games, etc. The beautiful thing about Star Wars is George Lucas laid out a universe where you can tell practically any kind of story and it'll work. You want to tell a story about a single hero taking down an empire? You got it. You want a tragedy about the downfall of a once noble warrior? You got it. You want a show that's inspired by Western and samurai films? You got it. You want a show that's inspired by Amblin Entertainment films from the 80s? You got it. You want a show about how living in a fascist regime is really terrible and how a little spark of hope could lead to its downfall? You got it. There are still so many things you could do with this franchise. Like, for example, this is going to be another tangent, please make a horror film for Star Wars. I know Scott Derrickson had ideas for a Wampa horror film on Hoth that I would pay good money for. Or there were those zombie troopers in Ahsoka that probably appeared in something else. I don't quite remember it off the top of my head. There's still so much you could do. I just don't want that potential wasted because of some dumb bullshit. Guess what happened when I was recording for this video? I want to thank all of you for listening to my yapping for God knows how long. I'm always down to talk about Star Wars, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to, especially as there's a ton of things I didn't know about it before working on this video. After this, I'm probably going to finish my series about the DCEU, and I'll also be working on a video about the films I saw that came out in 2025. Either way, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. I should mention this, as it may have caused a little bit of confusion. While this series did start airing before the release of Rise of Skywalker, Season 1 ended after the premiere of Rise of Skywalker. I figured that I'd count when the season finale aired to be when I would discuss it. Also, highlighting all the theatrical films then the shows is also just a much better flow than awkwardly dropping a series review and dripping. Dripping? What the fuck? Oh, Wesley, I'm dripping. Fuck. I do feel like with this episode, it feels like they're rushing things a bit. I honestly feel like this and the finale should have just been combined into one massive episode because of how weirdly rushed these episodes feel. Like Brutus being disposed of kind of underwhelmingly. Now, I might be biased because I quite liked Brutus's design and being able to bring back the Shistavanin? Fuck, that is a fucking mouthful. Jesus Christ.